Matt Serra upsetting GSP, April 7th, 2007, UFC 69. GSP was the UFC welterweight champion and considered nearly untouchable. His opponent was Matt Serra, former Ultimate Fighter winner who'd earned his title shot through the reality show. Serra was a 10-1 underdog. Nobody gave him a chance. Then the fight started. Early in the first round, Serra caught GSP with a punch behind the ear. GSP stumbled. Serra swarmed him with punches, and GSP couldn't recover. The referee stopped the fight at 3:25 of the first round. It was one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. The Canadian superstar had been dethroned by a fighter most people saw as a gatekeeper. Serra became champion, and GSP was left stunned. But the loss changed St. Pierre. He came back sharper, more focused, and more dominant. He reclaimed the title in a rematch less than a year later and went on to become one of the greatest fighters ever. Serra's upset remains a reminder that in MMA, anything can happen. Anderson Silva's UFC debut. When Anderson Silva made his UFC debut on June 28, 2006, no one knew they were watching the beginning of the greatest title reign in UFC history. Silva wasn't a big name yet. He fought in smaller organizations and had a reputation as a solid middleweight, but nothing more. His debut opponent was Chris Lieben, a tough, aggressive brawler who'd gained fame on The Ultimate Fighter. Lieben was considered a real test. The fight lasted 49 seconds. Silva knocked him out with a devastating knee and punches, barely breaking a sweat. It was violent, precise, and effortless. 3 months later, Silva fought for the middleweight title against Rich Franklin and knocked him out in the first round. That began a reign of dominance that lasted over 6 years. Silva defended his title 10 consecutive times, a UFC record. He finished fights with front kicks to the face, submissions, and knockouts that looked like they came from a movie. Silva made elite fighters look slow and predictable. The first UFC event, November 12, 1993, Denver, Colorado. The UFC didn't start as a sport. It started as a spectacle. The concept was simple and brutal. Take fighters from different martial arts, put them in an octagonal cage, and see what works. No weight classes, no time limits, barely any rules. You could win by submission, knockout, or throwing in the towel. That was it. The event was called UFC 1, the beginning, and it was designed to answer one question. Which martial art is the most effective? Royce Gracie, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner weighing 170 pounds, shocked everyone by submitting 3 opponents in one night, including a 200-pound boxer and a 400-pound sumo wrestler. It wasn't about size or strength. It was about technique. The event was pay-per-view only, held in a small arena, and considered underground. But it proved that grappling and ground fighting could neutralize striking and raw power. UFC 1 wasn't pretty, and it wasn't refined, but it changed combat sports forever. It showed that fighting could be studied, not just survived. McGregor's boxing match with Mayweather. In 2017, Conor McGregor did something no UFC fighter had ever done. He left MMA to box Floyd Mayweather, one of the greatest boxers of all time. It was a spectacle from the start. McGregor, a 2-division UFC champion with 0 professional boxing matches, challenged Mayweather to a fight under boxing rules. Most people thought it was a publicity stunt. It wasn't. The fight happened on August 26, 2017 in Las Vegas. McGregor earned a reported $100 million. Mayweather earned over $200 million. It became one of the highest grossing pay-per-views in history. In the ring, McGregor started strong, pressuring Mayweather early, but by the middle rounds, Mayweather's experience took over. He stopped McGregor in the 10th round by TKO. McGregor lost, but he didn't lose credibility. He proved a UFC fighter could hang with a boxing legend for 10 rounds and walked away with generational wealth. The fight also elevated the UFC's profile and showed that MMA stars could cross over into other sports and draw massive audiences. Khamzat Chimaev's 10-day, 2-fight breakout in July 2020, during the height of the pandemic, a virtually unknown welterweight named Khamzat Chimaev stepped into the octagon on Fight Island. He destroyed his opponent in 2 rounds. Then, 10 days later, he did it again. Chimaev became the first fighter in modern UFC history to win 2 fights in just 10 days apart. Both finishes were dominant. He barely took damage. His cardio looked fresh. He looked like he could fight again the next week. The UFC and fans went into a frenzy. Dana White called him a problem for the division. Chimaev's confidence was off the charts. He called out everyone, demanded title shots, and backed it up with terrifying performances. His wrestling was relentless. His striking was improving. He looked like a future champion. That 10-day streak made him an instant star and one of the most talked about fighters in the sport. It was a breakout moment unlike anything the UFC had seen. Francis Ngannou beef Dana White. Francis Ngannou was the UFC heavyweight champion and one of the most feared knockout artists in MMA history. But behind the scenes, tensions were building between him and UFC president Dana White. The issue was money. Ngannou wanted fighter pay increased across the board, better health insurance, and the ability to box on the side, something the UFC historically didn't allow. He also wanted a bigger cut of revenue. White and the UFC refused. Contract negotiations dragged on publicly. Ngannou defended his title in January 2022 against Cyril Gane, winning by decision despite fighting with a torn MCL and damaged ACL. After the fight, White didn't put the belt on him. Someone else did. The tension was obvious. Months passed with no new deal. In January 2023, the UFC announced Ngannou was no longer champion. He'd been stripped and released. Ngannou walked away from the biggest MMA promotion in the world to sign with the PFL and pursue boxing. The fallout sparked massive debate about fighter pay and UFC contracts. Just recently, Dana White shared more details about him and Francis's issues. Oliveira missing weight controversy. May 7th, 2022, UFC 274 in Phoenix. Charles Oliveira, the UFC lightweight champion, stepped on the scale for his title defense against Justin Gaethje. The limit was 155 pounds. Oliveira weighed in at 155.5, half a pound over. He was stripped of his title on the spot. It was a stunning moment. Oliveira had never missed weight before as a lightweight. He'd made 155 over a dozen times without issue. His team claimed the scale backstage showed him on weight. They argued the official scale was off or improperly calibrated. The Arizona Athletic Commission disagreed. Under UFC rules, if a champion misses weight, they're stripped immediately. The title became vacant. If Oliveira won the fight, he couldn't reclaim it. Only Gaethje could become champion. Oliveira went into the octagon titleless, but motivated. He submitted Gaethje in the first round, putting on one of the best performances of his career. Despite the dominant win, he had to fight again to reclaim the belt. The controversy sparked debates about scale accuracy, weight cutting, and whether a half pound should cost someone their championship. Reebok uniform backlash. In 2015, the UFC announced a landmark sponsorship deal with Reebok. The plan was to give every fighter a uniform, create a unified look, and bring legitimacy to the sport. Fighters would wear Reebok gear exclusively during fight week. In exchange, they'd receive tiered sponsorship payments based on their ranking and number of fights. Sounds good on paper. In reality, it was a disaster. Before Reebok, fighters could bring in their own sponsors, local gyms, supplement companies, car dealerships. Those deals often paid mid-tier fighters more than their fight purses. Some made $50,000 to $100,000 just from sponsors. Reebok's payouts were far lower, sometimes as little as $3,500 for newer fighters. Established names lost six figures in sponsor money overnight. The backlash was immediate. Fighters publicly criticized the deal. Fans sided with them. The uniforms themselves were bland, often misspelling fighter names or countries. Reebok became a symbol of the UFC prioritizing corporate partnerships over fighter compensation. The deal lasted until 2020, but the damage to fighter UFC relations was lasting. Switch from Reebok to Venom. In 2021, the UFC ended its partnership with Reebok and signed a new apparel deal with Venom, a combat sports brand with deep roots in MMA. The switch was seen as a fresh start after years of fighter complaints about Reebok's low payouts and poor quality. Venom brought better designs, more authentic fight gear, and slightly higher sponsorship payments for fighters. The base pay increased across the board, with newer fighters earning closer to $4,000 and champions receiving higher tier compensation. The gear itself was better received. Venom specialized in combat sports, so the fit and durability improved. Fighters appreciated the shift, though many still argued the payments were too low compared to what they could earn with independent sponsors. The Venom deal didn't fix the underlying issue of fighter pay, but it was an acknowledgement that the Reebok partnership had been a failure. It also gave fighters slightly more money and better looking gear, even if it didn't solve the bigger economic problem facing non-star athletes in the UFC. First women's division, added to UFC. For years, UFC president Dana White said women would never fight in the UFC. He didn't believe it would draw. Then Ronda Rousey changed everything. Rousey was an Olympic bronze medalist in judo who transitioned to MMA and became a star in Strikeforce, a rival promotion. She was finishing opponents in seconds with arm bars, drawing massive attention. In 2012, White reversed course. The UFC announced it would add a women's bantamweight division, and Rousey would be its first champion. She made her debut at UFC 157 in February 2013, submitting Liz Carmouche in the first round. The fight was a massive success. It proved that women could headline major cards and deliver exciting fights. Rousey became one of the biggest stars in the entire sport, male or female. Her popularity opened the door for other women's divisions: strawweight, featherweight, flyweight. Fighters like Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko became stars. Women's MMA went from non-existent in the UFC to a cornerstone of the promotion in less than a decade. First season of The Ultimate Fighter. In 2005, the UFC was on the brink of bankruptcy. Pay-per-view buys were down. Mainstream media ignored the sport. Spike TV, cable network looking for content, took a chance. They partnered with the UFC to create a reality show called The Ultimate Fighter. The concept was simple. 16 fighters live in a house, train under 2 coaches, and compete in elimination fights for a UFC contract. The first season featured coaches Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture, 2 of the biggest names in the sport. The finale on April 9th, 2005, changed everything. Boris Griffin and Stephan Bonnar delivered one of the greatest fights in UFC history. A back-and-forth war that had both fighters pouring blood and refusing to quit. Griffin won by decision, but Dana White gave both fighters contracts. The fight was so compelling that it drew massive ratings and introduced millions of casual viewers to MMA. The Ultimate Fighter saved the UFC. It brought legitimacy, new fans, and showed that MMA could be compelling television beyond just the fight. UFC COVID shutdown. In March 2020, as COVID-19 spread globally, sports leagues shut down one by one. The UFC had events scheduled but no clear path forward. UFC 249, set for April 18th, was postponed after ESPN and Disney, the UFC's broadcast partners, pressured Dana White to stop. For a brief moment, the UFC went dark. Fighters were stuck at home. Gyms closed. Training camps ended. It was unclear when or how live fights could return. White explored every option: private islands, international venues, closed-door arenas. He was determined to bring fights back faster than anyone else. By early May, he'd secured approval to hold events in Jacksonville, Florida, which had looser restrictions. The UFC returned on May 9th, 2020, with UFC 249. No fans, daily fighter testing, strict protocols. It was strange, but it worked. For months, the UFC was the only major live sport on television. They held events almost every week, keeping fighters employed, fans entertained during a global crisis. Quick return cemented the UFC's reputation for adaptability. Dana White slapping his wife on camera. On New Year's Eve, 2022, TMZ released video footage showing UFC President Dana White and his wife, Ann, in a physical altercation at a nightclub in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. The video showed Ann slapping Dana and Dana slapping her back. Footage went viral immediately. White released a statement acknowledging the incident, calling it inexcusable, and saying there was no defense for his actions. He said he and his wife had been drinking, got into an argument, and things escalated. Ann also released a statement saying they'd been married for decades. This was a private matter, and they were handling it as a family. The public response was divided. Some called for White to resign. Others pointed out the hypocrisy of only focusing on his retaliation. Domestic violence organizations condemned both parties. The UFC's parent company, Endeavor, did not suspend or fine White. He remained in his role as president. The incident sparked broader debates about accountability, domestic violence, and whether White's position as a public figure leading a combat sports organization should have led to consequences. Strip down Towelgate. Daniel Cormier, January 2017, UFC 210 early weigh-ins. Daniel Cormier, the light heavyweight champion, was scheduled to defend his title against Anthony Johnson. The weight limit was 205 pounds. Cormier stepped on the scale fully clothed and missed weight. He was over. With only minutes left in the weigh-in window, Cormier stripped down completely, holding a towel in front of himself for modesty. He stepped back on the scale. This time, 205 pounds exactly. He made weight. The fight was on. Fans and media immediately noticed something odd. Cormier's hands were on the towel, which was draped over a metal bar attached to the scale. It looked like he was pushing down on the towel to reduce the weight on the scale. Fighters and analysts called it out. If he was leaning on anything, the weigh-in was invalid. Cormier denied cheating, saying he was only holding the towel for coverage. The New York State Athletic Commission reviewed the footage and said the weigh-in was valid. Cormier fought Johnson the next night and won by submission. The controversy never led to any official action, but Towelgate became MMA legend. Nick Diaz's 5-year marijuana suspension outrage in January 2015. Nick Diaz fought Anderson Silva at UFC 183 in Las Vegas. Both fighters tested positive for banned substances after the fight. Silva for steroids, Diaz for marijuana metabolite. The Nevada Athletic Commission suspended Silva for 1 year. They suspended Diaz for 5 years, fined him $165,000, 100% of his fight purse. Silva Silva used performance-enhancing drugs. Diaz used marijuana, which doesn't enhance performance and is legal in Nevada. The 5-year ban was the harshest punishment the commission had ever handed down for marijuana. Fighters, fans, and even mainstream media erupted. It felt like punishment for Diaz's personality and history of positive marijuana tests more than the actual offense. Diaz had tested positive twice before. 5 years seemed excessive, especially compared to steroid users getting 12 to 24 months. After massive public backlash, the commission reduced Diaz's suspension to 18 months in 2016. He was also allowed to reapply for his license earlier. The case became a rallying cry for cannabis reform in sports and highlighted the inconsistency of athletic commission punishment. Chael Sonnen, ESPN hotel fight incident, December 2024. Chael Sonnen, retired UFC fighter and longtime MMA analyst, was at a Las Vegas hotel for an ESPN broadcast. According to reports and witnesses, Sonnen got into a confrontation with a couple in the hotel. The details are murky, but it escalated into a physical altercation. Sonnen allegedly struck multiple people, including the woman involved. Security intervened. Police were called. Sonnen was cited for misdemeanor battery. He was not arrested, but was issued a citation and later released. ESPN immediately pulled him from upcoming broadcasts. The incident shocked the MMA community. Sonnen had reinvented himself as a media personality, known for his inarticulate breakdowns of fights. He was one of the most recognizable voices outside the cage. Now, he was facing legal trouble and potential career fallout. The case is still ongoing, but Sonnen's reputation took a major hit. The incident raised questions about impulse control, alcohol involvement, and how past fighters handle post-career stress. It also reminded fans that not all controversies happen inside the octagon. Hardy inhaler incident on live broadcast October 2019, UFC Fight Night in Boston. Greg Hardy, former NFL player turned heavyweight fighter, was in the middle of his co-main event fight against Ben Sassoli. Between rounds, Hardy was visibly struggling to breathe. His corner handed him an inhaler. He took 2 puffs, then kept fighting. Commentators and fans watching live were confused. Inhalers aren't illegal in daily life, but in combat sports, they require a therapeutic use exemption, TUE, from athletic commissions. Hardy didn't have one. Using an inhaler during a fight without approval is a violation. The Massachusetts State Athletic Commission immediately launched an investigation. After the fight, which Hardy won by decision, his team claimed he had asthma, and the inhaler contained albuterol, a legal medication with proper approval, but Hardy never disclosed it beforehand. The commission ruled that Hardy's team failed to follow protocol. The result was overturned to a no contest. Hardy wasn't suspended, but the controversy added to his already polarizing reputation. The incident highlighted gaps in fighter medical disclosures and the importance of transparency with athletic commissions. Introduction of unified rules. In the late 1990s, the UFC was in crisis. Senator John McCain called it human cockfighting. Pay-per-view providers dropped it. State athletic commissions refused to sanction events. The sport was nearly banned nationwide. Something had to change. In 2000, the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board worked with UFC owners to create a standardized rule set, the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts. These rules introduced timed rounds, weight classes, a list of fouls, and mandatory safety measures like gloves and referee stoppages. Strikes to the back of the head, headbutts, groin shots, and eye gouging were banned. Fighters had to wear fingerless gloves. Rounds were set at 5 minutes with 1-minute breaks. The unified rules didn't just make the sport safer, they made it sanctionable. States began allowing UFC events again. Sponsors returned. The sport started its climb toward legitimacy. By 2009, the unified rules were adopted across the United States, and the UFC transformed from underground brawl to regulated professional sport. UFC antitrust lawsuit unsealed documents. In December 2024, a federal judge unsealed documents from a long-running antitrust lawsuit against the UFC. The case, filed in 2014, accused the promotion of operating as an illegal monopoly that suppressed fighter pay and restricted their ability to work for other organizations. For years, the UFC fought to keep internal financial records private. When the documents were finally released, they revealed shocking details. The UFC's revenue share with fighters was significantly lower than other major sports. While the NFL and NBA give athletes roughly 50% of revenue, the unsealed documents showed UFC fighters received closer to 16 to 20%. The files also exposed restrictive contract practices, including clauses that automatically extended fighter deals after championship wins, and matching rights that made it nearly impossible for fighters to negotiate with competitors. Email exchanges between executives showed deliberate strategies to suppress wages and maintain market dominance. The revelations reignited debates about fighter unionization and fair pay. Several active and former fighters publicly called for reform. The lawsuit itself was settled in 2024 for $330 $35 million, but the unsealed documents provided the clearest picture yet of how the UFC operates financially behind closed doors. The BMF belt origin. In 2019, the UFC created a title that had never existed before, the Baddest Motherfucker Championship. It wasn't an official weight class, it was pure spectacle, and it worked perfectly. The belt was created for a fight between Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz at UFC 244 in Madison Square Garden. Both fighters had massive fan followings and reputations for never backing down. Masvidal was on a tear, having knocked out Darren Till and Ben Askren in brutal fashion. Diaz was a cult hero known for his toughness and trash talk. The BMF concept reportedly came from Masvidal himself, who wanted a fight that meant something beyond ranking. Dana White loved it. The UFC commissioned a one-of-a-kind belt, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson agreed to present it to the winner. The fight lived up to the hype. Masvidal dominated before the doctor stopped the fight in the 4th round due to a cut on Diaz's eye. Masvidal became the first and only BMF champion. The belt was never defended. It was a moment, not a division, but it captured exactly what it was supposed to. Two fighters with massive respect throwing down for pride. How Joe Rogan became a commentator for the UFC. Joe Rogan didn't start as a UFC commentator. He started as a fan. In the late 1990s, Rogan was a stand-up comedian and the host of Fear Factor. He'd been training in martial arts since he was a teenager, holding a black belt in Taekwondo and training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. When the UFC was still underground and struggling for legitimacy, Rogan would attend events just because he loved fighting. He became friends with some of the fighters and UFC staff. In 1997, Rogan was offered a job as a backstage interviewer for UFC 12. He did it free because he just wanted to be involved. His passion and knowledge were obvious. By 2002, the UFC brought him on as a color commentator alongside Mike Goldberg. Rogan brought energy, technical breakdowns, and genuine excitement to the broadcast. He explained grappling and submissions in ways casual fans could understand. As the UFC grew, so did Rogan's profile. His podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, became one of the biggest in the world, and his dual role as comedian and commentator made him one of the most recognizable voices in MMA. He's been calling fights for over 2 decades. CM Punk signing. With UFC, in December 2014, the UFC made one of the most controversial signings in company history. They brought in CM Punk, a professional wrestler from WWE with zero MMA experience, and gave him a contract to fight in the octagon. Punk, whose real name is Phil Brooks, was a massive star in pro wrestling, but had never competed in mixed martial art. He was 36 years old. Dana White defended the signing, saying Punk was a legitimate draw who wanted to test himself. Critics called it a publicity stunt that disrespected real fighters grinding for years to get a UFC contract. Punk trained for nearly 2 years before his debut. In September 2016 at UFC 203, he fought Mickey Gall, a relatively unknown fighter with a 2-0 record. Gall submitted Punk in the first round. It wasn't competitive. Punk tried again in June 2018 against Mike Jackson. He lost a unanimous decision. He had a fight where Jackson appeared to take it easy on him. Punk went 0-2 in the UFC and never fought again. The experiment was widely seen as a failure, but it generated massive attention and pay-per-view buys, which was likely the point all along. Tito Ortiz vs. Ken Shamrock rivalry. Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock built one of the UFC's first major rivalry, and it was personal from the start. Shamrock was an early UFC legend, one of the sport's original stars. Ortiz was the young, brash light heavyweight champion with a massive ego. Their beef started in the early 2000s when Ortiz repeatedly disrespected Shamrock in interviews, calling him old and washed up. Shamrock, never one to back down, fired back. The tension built for years. They were supposed to fight in 2002, but Shamrock pulled out due to injury. The rivalry simmered. By 2006, finally met at UFC 61. Ortiz dominated, stopping Shamrock in the first round with ground and pound. But the bad blood didn't end. They ran it back at UFC 66 in December 2006. Ortiz won again, this time by submission in the 3rd round. After the fight, things got uglier. Shamrock accused Ortiz of greasing and using illegal tactics. Ortiz mocked him in press conferences. The feud spilled into other promotions years later, with both fighters trading insults well into their 40s. It was messy, personal, and one of the most intense rivalries in UFC history. Jones vs. Cormier rivalry. John Jones and Daniel Cormier hated each other, and it showed every time they were in the same room. The rivalry started in 2014 when Cormier, an undefeated heavyweight moving down to light heavyweight, emerged as the top contender. Jones was the champion and arguably the best pound-for-pound fighter alive. First face-off at a media event turned into a shoving match that had to be broken up by security. The animosity was real. Jones mocked Cormier's wrestling credentials. Cormier called Jones a fake and a cheat. At UFC 182 in January 2015, Jones won a dominant decision. decision. At UFC 214 in July 2017, Jones knocked Cormier out in the third round with a head kick, but the knockout was later overturned to a no contest after Jones tested positive for steroids. Cormier regained the title and called Jones a cheater who would never beat him clean. Jones denied knowingly taking anything. The back and forth continued for years. Even after both retired from light heavyweight, the hatred remained. Their rivalry was personal, bitter, and one of the most compelling in combat sports history. Masvidal versus Covington rivalry. Jorge Masvidal and Colby Covington were once training partners and friends at American Top Team in Florida. They cornered each other's fights and lived in the same gym culture. Then Covington adopted a heel persona, started wearing MAGA hat, and trash-talked everyone, including Masvidal. The friendship fractured. By 2019, the relationship was done. Covington accused Masvidal of being washed up and avoided fighting real contenders. Masvidal called Covington fake and a coward. The insults got personal, involving families and former coaches. They fought at UFC 272 in March 2022. Covington dominated with wrestling, winning a lopsided decision, but the rivalry didn't end there. Weeks later, Masvidal allegedly attacked Covington outside a Miami steakhouse, punching him and fleeing. Covington pressed charges. Masvidal was arrested and faced felony battery charges. He eventually pleaded guilty and received probation. The incident took the rivalry from competitive trash talk to actual criminal behavior. It remains one of the most personal and ugly feuds in UFC history, fueled by betrayal, ego, and legitimate hatred between former friends. Silva versus Sonnen rivalry. Anderson Silva was the unbeatable middleweight king. Chael Sonnen was the trash-talking challenger who refused to show respect. Their rivalry was built almost entirely on Sonnen's mouth. Leading up to their first fight at UFC 117 in August 2010, Sonnen delivered some of the greatest pre-fight promos in MMA history. He mocked Silva's skills, called Brazil a dump, and claimed he'd dominate the champion. Most thought it was hype. Then the fight happened. Sonnen controlled Silva for 4.5 rounds with relentless wrestling, landing over 300 strikes. He was minutes away from winning the title. Then Silva locked in a triangle armbar with 1 minute 50 seconds left in the 5th round. Sonnen tapped. Silva retained, but Sonnen had proven he could be beaten. The rematch happened at UFC 148 in July 2012. Once again, Sonnen talked endlessly. This time, Silva stopped him in the 2nd round with a brutal knee. After the fight, Sonnen tested positive PEDS, adding another layer to the story. Despite losing twice, Sonnen's ability to sell fights and get under Silva's skin made their rivalry legendary. It proved that sometimes the build-up matters just as much as the result. Anderson Silva leg break versus Weidman, December 28, 2013, UFC 168 in Las Vegas. Anderson Silva was trying to reclaim the middleweight title he'd lost to Chris Weidman 6 months earlier. Silva had been knocked out in their first fight, ending his 7-year reign as champion. The rematch was his chance at redemption. First round was competitive. Silva was finding his rhythm, checking kicks and landing strikes. Then, early in the 2nd round, Silva threw a low leg kick at Weidman. Weidman checked it, lifting his shin to block. Silva's shin collided with Weidman's knee. The sound was immediate and sickening. Silva's leg snapped. His fibula and tibia broke completely. He collapsed, his leg bending grotesquely in a direction. Legs don't bend. The arena went silent. Weidman stepped back in shock. Medical staff rushed in. Replays showed the leg flopping as Silva fell. It was one of the most horrific injuries in UFC history. Silva was carried out on a stretcher and underwent immediate surgery. The break required a titanium rod inserted into his leg. He was 38 years old, and many assumed his career was over. Remarkably, Silva returned 13 months later, but he was never the same fighter. The leg break marked the definitive end of his dominance. Leon Edwards head kick KO vs. Usman August 20th, 2022. UFC 278 in Salt Lake City. Leon Edwards was challenging Kamaru Usman for the welterweight title. Usman was on a 19-fight win streak and had never lost in the UFC. He was considered one of the most dominant champions in the sport. Edwards was a massive underdog despite being on his own unbeaten streak. For 4.5 rounds, Usman controlled the fight. He used his wrestling, pressed Edwards against the cage, and landed the harder shot. Commentators were already discussing Usman's legacy and what came next. Edwards was behind on the scorecards, running out of time. Then, with 56 seconds left in the 5th round, Edwards threw a high kick. Usman, exhausted and potentially overconfident, didn't see it coming. The kick landed flush on his chin. Usman crumpled to the canvas, unconscious before he hit the ground. Edwards became the new champion in one of the most dramatic knockouts in title fight history. His reaction said it all. "Look at me now," he screamed, tears streaming. It was the biggest underdog comeback knockout in recent UFC memory, and instantly became one of the sport's most replayed moments. Masvidal flying knee, July 6th, 2019, UFC 239 in Las Vegas. Jorge Masvidal faced Ben Askren in one of the most anticipated welterweight matchups of the year. Askren was an undefeated wrestler known for his trash talk and awkward style. Masvidal was a veteran striker who'd been in the game for 15 years. Pre-fight buildup was hostile, both fighters exchanging insults for weeks. When the fight began, Askren came forward immediately, likely planning to shoot for a takedown. Masvidal had other plans. He sprinted across the octagon and launched a flying knee directly at Askren's face. The knee landed perfect. Askren was unconscious before he hit the canvas. The official time, 5 seconds. It was the fastest knockout in UFC history. The arena erupted. Masvidal celebrated wildly, while Askren lay motionless, being tended to by doctors. The knockout became an instant viral moment, replayed millions of times across social media. It launched Masvidal into superstardom and earned him the BMF title fight against Nate Diaz months later. For Askren, it was a brutal reality check. For Masvidal, it was the defining moment of his career and one of the most iconic knockouts ever. Poirier knocking out McGregor, July 10th, 2021, UFC 264 in Las Vegas. Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier met for the third time, with the series tied 1-1. Their first fight in 2014 saw McGregor win by knockout. Their second in January 2021 saw Poirier return the favor. The trilogy was meant to settle it. The fight started aggressively. McGregor came out firing. Poirier stayed composed, checking leg kicks and landing heavy shots. Late in the first round, McGregor stepped back awkwardly and his ankle gave out. He fell to the canvas, his leg visibly broken. Poirier landed ground strikes as the round ended. When McGregor tried to stand, his leg buckled beneath him. The doctor immediately waved off the fight. Poirier won by TKO due to doctor stoppage, but the story didn't end there. As McGregor sat against the cage with a shattered ankle, he screamed threats at Poirier and his wife. It was ugly and uncomfortable. McGregor was stretchered out, underwent surgery, faced a long recovery. The injury sidelined him for over a year. Poirier moved on to a title shot. The rivalry, once competitive and respectful, ended in chaos and bitterness, with McGregor's leg break becoming one of the most shocking moments in UFC history. UFC new glove failure. In 2024, the UFC introduced redesigned gloves meant to reduce eye poke, one of the sport's most persistent problems. The old gloves had fingers that naturally extended outward, leading to frequent accidental eye pokes during fights. The new design featured a more curved finger position, supposedly keeping hands in a more natural fist. The UFC heavily promoted the change as a major safety improvement. Then the gloves debuted in actual fights. Almost immediately, problems emerged. Fighters complained the gloves were too stiff and restricted hand movement. Worse, eye pokes didn't decrease. In some events, they seemed to happen even more frequently. Fighters reported the gloves felt uncomfortable and affected their ability to grapple and strike naturally. Some said the padding was too thin, leading to hand injuries. Others noted the fit was inconsistent between sizes. The backlash was swift. Fighters publicly criticized the new design. Analysts pointed out that the UFC had rushed the rollout without enough testing. By mid-2024, the promotion quietly made adjustments to the glove design, but the damage was done. Failed glove launch became another example of the UFC implementing changes without proper fighter input, prioritizing optics over actual functionality. Kimbo Slice debuts in UFC Kimbo Slice was the first true viral MMA star, and he got famous through backyard street fights posted on YouTube. Born Kevin Ferguson, Kimbo became an internet sensation in the mid-2000s, brutal unregulated brawls filmed in Miami. The videos racked up millions of views. He was a massive bearded brawler with legitimate knockout power and zero formal training. In 2008, he transitioned to professional MMA, fighting for Elite XC, a rival promotion. His fights drew massive ratings despite his limited skills. When Elite XC folded, the UFC saw an opportunity. In December 2009, Kimbo appeared on The Ultimate Fighter Season 10 as a contestant. He wasn't a polished fighter, but he was a draw. His first official UFC fight came at the Ultimate Fighter finale in December 2009 against Roy Nelson. Nelson, a skilled grappling heavy fighter, submitted Kimbo in the second round with a crucifix choke. It wasn't competitive. Kimbo fought once more in the UFC in May 2010, losing a decision to Matt Mitrione. After that, the UFC released him. Kimbo's UFC run was short and forgettable in terms of results, but his presence brought eyeballs and proved that internet fame could translate to combat sports interest, even if the skills didn't match the hype. Conor McGregor bus attack in Brooklyn, April 5th, 2018. UFC 223 3 media day at Barclays Center in Brooklyn. Conor McGregor, who'd been stripped of the lightweight title months earlier, flew to New York with a group of friends and cornermen. His target, Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was scheduled to fight for the vacant title that weekend. Khabib had been involved in a confrontation with McGregor's teammate, Artem Lobov, days earlier. McGregor wanted revenge. He and his crew entered the loading dock area of the arena where fighters were boarding buses after media obligations. McGregor grabbed a metal dolly and hurled it at a bus carrying Khabib and other fighters. The dolly shattered a window. Glass flew everywhere. Lightweight Michael Chiesa was cut by shattered glass and pulled from his fight due to injury. Flyweight Ray Borg suffered corneal damage and was also removed from the card. McGregor was captured on video screaming and throwing objects. He fled the scene but turned himself in to NYPD hours later. He was charged with assault and criminal mischief. The incident was reckless, dangerous, and had real consequences for innocent fighters. McGregor eventually took a plea deal, avoided jail time, paid restitution. The attack became one of the most infamous moments in UFC history. Paddy Pimblett, UFC debut hype, September 2021. Paddy the Baddy Pimblett made his UFC debut at UFC Fight Night in Las Vegas, and the promotion treated it like a main event, despite him being a newcomer. Pimblett was a former Cage Warriors champion from Liverpool, England, with a massive social media following and a personality that demanded attention. He had blonde hair, thick Scouse accent, and wasn't shy about talking. The UFC saw him as the next big British star, possibly the heir to Conor McGregor's throne, as the sport's biggest draw. His debut opponent was Luigi Vendramini. Pimblett got dropped hard in the first round, stumbling backward and nearly finished. Then he rallied, landing a barrage of punches that forced a stoppage. After the win, he grabbed the mic and delivered an emotional post-fight speech that went viral. The UFC immediately pushed him as a future star, giving him main card spots and favorable matchups. Over the next 2 years, Pimblett built a 5-0 UFC record, though several decisions were controversial. His ability to sell fights and connect fans made him one of the promotion's most talked about fighters, even if his skills didn't always match the hype. The debut was the beginning of a marketing machine. TJ Dillashaw EPO suspension. In January 2019, TJ Dillashaw dropped down from bantamweight to challenge Henry Cejudo for the flyweight title at UFC on ESPN +1 in Brooklyn. Cejudo knocked him out in 32 seconds. It was a shocking result, but what came next was even worse. Weeks later, Dillashaw voluntarily relinquished his bantamweight title and announced he was stepping away from competition. The reason soon became clear. He tested positive for recombinant human erythropoietin, EPO, powerful endurance-enhancing drug used by cyclists and distance athletes. EPO increases red blood cell production, boosting oxygen delivery and stamina. It's one of the most serious performance-enhancing drugs an athlete can use. The U.S. Anti-Doping Agency suspended Dillashaw for 2 years, one of the harshest penalties in UFC history. Dillashaw admitted to using EPO in the lead-up to the Cejudo fight, claiming he wanted an edge while cutting to 125 pounds. The admission tainted his legacy. Fans and fighters questioned whether he'd been cheating throughout his championship runs. His rival Cody Garbrandt, who lost to Dillashaw twice, publicly said he'd been robbed by a cheater. Dillashaw returned in 2021 after serving his suspension, but never reclaimed his status. UFC 151 cancellation. UFC 151 was scheduled for September 1st, 2012 in Las Vegas. It was supposed to be headlined by light heavyweight champion Jon Jones defending his title against Dan Henderson. 8 days before the event, Henderson pulled out due to a knee injury. The UFC scrambled to find a replacement. They offered the fight to Chael Sonnen, who accepted immediately despite being a middleweight. Jones and his coach, Greg Jackson, refused the fight, saying Sonnen's wrestling-heavy style required specific preparation, and 8 days wasn't enough time. Dana White was furious, publicly blasted Jones for refusing to save the card. With no main event and no time to build a replacement, the UFC made an unprecedented decision, canceled the entire event. It was the first time in UFC history an event was canceled outright. Fans who'd bought tickets were refunded. Fighters on the undercard lost their paycheck. White blamed Jones entirely, saying he cost dozens of fighters their income. Jones became a villain overnight. The fallout damaged his public image and strained his relationship with the UFC. The incident also led to rule changes, with the UFC building deeper cards to prevent future cancellation. Jon Jones, hiding under a cage for hours to avoid drug testers. In 2016, Jon Jones was preparing for his return fight against Daniel Cormier at UFC 200. He was already under intense scrutiny after previous failed drug tests and legal issues. USADA drug testers showed up unannounced at Jackson Wink MMA in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Jones trained. According to multiple reports and witness accounts, when testers arrived, Jones hid. Specifically, he crawled under the octagon cage in the gym and stayed there for several hours while testers waited. The story came out later through gym members and became MMA legend. Jones has never fully confirmed or denied the specifics, but the implication was clear. He was avoiding a drug test. Under USADA rules, refusing or evading a test counts as a failed test and results in suspension. However, Jones eventually provided a sample that day after emerging. Weeks later, he tested positive for 2 banned substances anyway, and was pulled from UFC 200 just days before the fight. The hiding incident became symbolic of Jones's troubled relationship with drug testing and added to the narrative that his greatness was tainted by PEDs. It remains one of the strangest and most damning stories in his controversial career. Strickland versus Sneeko sparring. In 2024, UFC middleweight champion Sean Strickland invited Sneeko, a controversial internet streamer and influencer, to spar at his gym. Sneeko had been talking about fighting and training, presenting himself as tough online. Strickland, known for his blunt personality and no-nonsense approach, decided to test him. Video of the sparring session went viral. Strickland, a professional fighter with over a decade of experience, beat Sneeko up for several minutes. It wasn't competitive. Strickland landed clean punches, walked him down, and made Sneeko look helpless. At one point, Sneeko was visibly hurt and overwhelmed. The video sparked massive debate. Some said Strickland was bullying a non-fighter and putting someone at serious risk of injury. Others argued Sneeko asked for it, talking tough online and agreeing to spar a UFC champion. Sneeko himself downplayed it afterward, claiming he held his own, but the footage told a different story. The incident highlighted the growing trend of influencers trying to enter combat sports without understanding the gap between internet talk and actual fighting. Strickland used it to make a point. Talk is cheap, and real fighting is dangerous. Jones hitting a pregnant woman in hit and run. April 2015. John Jones, the reigning light heavyweight champion, was involved in a hit and run accident in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Jones ran a red light, crashed into another vehicle. The driver was a pregnant woman who suffered a broken arm in the collision. Instead of staying at the scene, Jones fled on foot. Witnesses saw him run from the vehicle. Police later found marijuana and a pipe in his rental car. Jones turned himself in the next day and was charged with felony hit and run. The UFC immediately stripped him of his title and suspended him indefinitely. It was one of the darkest moments in his career. Jones pleaded guilty and received 18 months of supervised probation. The incident shattered his public image and raised serious questions about his decision-making and character. The woman and her baby ultimately recovered, but the damage to Jones's reputation was severe. He'd already faced legal trouble before. Fleeing the scene of an accident involving a pregnant woman crossed a line that fans in the UFC couldn't ignore. Jones wouldn't fight again for over a year, and the incident remains a stain on his otherwise legendary career. Conor McGregor's 13-second KO of Jose Aldo. December 12, 2015, UFC 194 in Las Vegas. Conor McGregor challenged Jose Aldo for the featherweight championship in one of the most anticipated fights in UFC history. Aldo had been undefeated for a decade and held the title since the division's creation. McGregor had talked his way to a title shot with relentless trash talk and finishes. The build-up lasted months, with McGregor getting under Aldo's skin at every press conference and media event. When the fight finally started, Aldo came out aggressive, looking to silence McGregor early. He charged forward and threw a looping left hook. McGregor countered with a perfect left hand. Aldo's head snapped back. He crumpled to the canvas, unconscious. The official time, 13 seconds. It was the fastest finish in UFC title fight history. The arena exploded. McGregor climbed the cage and screamed in celebration. Aldo lay on the canvas in disbelief. A decade-long reign ended in the blink of an eye. The knockout catapulted McGregor to superstardom and began his rise to becoming the biggest draw in UFC history. For Aldo, it was a devastating end to an era of dominance, all erased in 13 seconds. Nate Diaz submitting Conor McGregor. March 5th, 2016, UFC 196 in Las Vegas. Conor McGregor was riding high after knocking out Jose Aldo and becoming featherweight champion. He was supposed to fight Rafael dos Anjos for the lightweight title, but dos Anjos pulled out injured. On 11 days' notice, Nate Diaz stepped in as a replacement. The fight was at welterweight, 170 pounds, 2 weight classes above where McGregor held his title. McGregor came out confident, landing clean shots early and talking trash mid-fight, but Diaz's chin held up. He absorbed everything and kept walking forward. By the second round, McGregor started to fade. Diaz opened up with volume striking, landing a clean 1-2 combination that hurt McGregor badly. McGregor shot for a desperate takedown. Diaz welcomed it, taking McGregor's back and locking in a rear naked choke. McGregor tapped at 4:12 of the second round. The upset was massive. McGregor, the seemingly unstopped trash-talking knockout artist, had been submitted by a late replacement opponent. Diaz celebrated by flipping off McGregor and shouting at his corner. The loss was McGregor's first in the UFC and proved he was human. It set up an immediate rematch 5 months later, which McGregor won by decision. Jon Jones, becoming the youngest champion. Ever March 19th, 2011, UFC 128 in Newark, New Jersey. Jon Jones challenged Mauricio Shogun Rua for the light heavyweight championship. Jones was just 23 years old and relatively unknown to casual fans despite being undefeated. Shogun was a legend, former Pride champion and the current UFC title holder. Most expected a competitive fight. Instead, Jones put on a clinic. He used his massive 84.5-inch reach to keep Shogun at distance, landing elbows, knees, and creative strikes from angles Shogun had never seen. Jones took Shogun down repeatedly and battered him on the ground. By the third round, Shogun was exhausted and hurt. The referee stopped the fight at 2:37 of the third round. At 23 years old, Jones became the youngest champion in UFC history, a record that still stands. The performance was dominant and terrifying. Jones looked like a completely different level of athlete. Over the next few years, he'd defend the title 8 consecutive times, dismantling every challenger. His youth, creativity, and physical gifts made him seem unstoppable. The Shogun fight wasn't just a title win, it was the arrival of a generational talent who would go on to dominate the division for over a decade. The first champ, McGregor at UFC 205, November 12, 2016. UFC 205 at Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was the UFC's first event in New York after the state finally legalized MMA. Conor McGregor was the featherweight champion and challenged Eddie Alvarez for the lightweight title. If he won, he'd become the first fighter in UFC history to hold 2 titles simultaneously. The fight was one-sided. McGregor dropped Alvarez 3 times in the first round alone, showcasing his precision striking and counterpunching. Alvarez, a tough veteran, couldn't find an answer. In the second round, McGregor landed a 4-punch combination, finished Alvarez for good. McGregor became the first simultaneous 2-division champion in UFC history. He stood in the octagon holding both belts, cementing his status as the biggest star the sport had ever seen. The champ moment became iconic, replayed endlessly, and turned into a symbol of McGregor's dominance. However, McGregor never defended either title. He was stripped of the featherweight belt shortly after, and later stripped of the lightweight belt as well. Despite never defending, the achievement of winning both titles remains a historic moment in UFC history. GSP returning to win the middleweight belt. November 4th, 2017, UFC 217 in Madison Square Garden. Georges St-Pierre, one of the greatest welterweights ever, returned to the UFC after a 4-year retirement. But instead of returning to welterweight, he moved up to middleweight to challenge Michael Bisping for the title. GSP was 36 years old and hadn't fought since 2013. Bisping was the champion and a massive underdog killer himself. Many questioned whether GSP could compete after such a long layoff, especially in a higher weight class. The fight was competitive early, with both men landing shots. In the third round, GSP took Bisping down and locked in a rear naked choke. Bisping went unconscious. GSP became middleweight champion and cemented his legacy as one of the sport's all-time greats. But the reign was short-lived. GSP vacated the title weeks later, citing health issues, specifically ulcerative colitis. He never defended the middleweight belt and never fought at that weight again. Despite the brief reign, his return and championship win at a higher weight class added another incredible chapter to his legendary career. It proved he could still compete at the highest level even after years away. Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier, Media Day Brawl, August 2014, UFC 178 Media Day at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier were scheduled to fight for the light heavyweight title, and the bad blood between them was already boiling. During a face-off for promotional photos, both fighters started talking trash. Cormier said something. Jones responded. Then Cormier shoved Jones. Jones shoved back harder. Within seconds, both men were swinging at each other. Security and UFC staff rushed in to separate them, but the chaos continued. Jones shoved Cormier into a backdrop, and both men kept trying to get at each other. Dana White physically stepped between them. The brawl was captured on camera and immediately went viral. Both fighters were fined by the Nevada Athletic Commission. Jones was fined $50,000, Cormier $9,000. The incident only amplified interest in their fight and proved the hatred was real. This wasn't manufactured rivalry for promotion. They genuinely despised each other. The fight itself lived up to the hype, with Jones winning by decision, but the Media Day Brawl remains one of the most infamous moments in UFC promotional history. Colby Covington's Chaos Persona, debuting in Brazil, August 2000. 2017, UFC Fight Night in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Colby Covington had just defeated Demian Maia by decision in front of a hostile Brazilian crowd. Covington was a skilled wrestler but relatively unknown and wasn't getting much attention from the UFC. His contract was reportedly in danger. During his post-fight interview, Covington grabbed the microphone and delivered a promo that changed his career. He called Brazil a dump, insulted the fans, and said the country was full of animals. The crowd erupted in boos. Security had to escort him out. Covington later said he knew his job was on the line and decided to become a villain to get attention. It worked. The UFC kept him, and he leaned fully into the chaos persona, wearing MAGA hat, insulting opponents and entire countries, playing the ultimate heel. He became one of the most polarizing figures in MMA, generating massive attention and pay-per-view interest despite being universally hated outside his fan base. The Brazil incident was the birth of the character that made him famous, proving that controversy and heat could save a career. When Dana White tried to get Fedor Emelianenko to sign, and failed for years, Fedor Emelianenko was considered the best heavyweight in the world, dominating Pride fighting championships in Japan. When Pride collapsed in 2007, the UFC tried to sign him. Dana White wanted Fedor badly. He was undefeated, a legend, and would have given the UFC heavyweight division instant credibility. But negotiations fell apart repeatedly. Fedor's management wanted co-promotion deals, where Fedor could fight in other organizations while under UFC contract. The UFC refused. They wanted exclusive rights. White publicly offered Fedor massive contracts, claiming he turned down more money than any heavyweight had ever been offered. Fedor's team disputed those claims. The back and forth lasted years, with both sides blaming each other. Fedor eventually signed with Strikeforce, a rival promotion, and later Bellator. He never fought in the UFC. White has called it one of his biggest regrets, and fans still debate what would have happened if Fedor had faced UFC heavyweights like Brock Lesnar or Cain Velasquez. The failed signing remains one of the biggest what-ifs in MMA history and a rare negotiation loss for Dana White. The UFC nearly going bankrupt. Before The Ultimate Fighter saved, by 2004, the UFC was on life support. Pay-per-view buys were dismal. Sponsors had pulled out. State athletic commissions still banned the sport in many places. The Fertitta brothers, who'd bought the UFC in 2001 for $2 million, had reportedly lost over $40 million trying to keep it afloat. They were seriously considering shutting it down. Then Spike TV, a cable network looking for cheap programming, offered to air a reality show. The UFC pitched The Ultimate Fighter, a competition where 16 fighters lived in a house, fought for a UFC contract. Spike agreed. The show debuted in January 2005 to modest rating, but the finale on April 9th, 2005 changed everything. Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar fought in a 3-round war that captivated viewers. The fight was brutal, back and forth, and emotional. It drew massive ratings and introduced millions to MMA. Overnight, the UFC went from irrelevant to must-watch. Pay-per-view buys exploded. Sponsorships returned. The Fertittas went from planning an exit to building an empire. The Ultimate Fighter didn't just save the UFC, it launched the modern MMA era. Nate Diaz, smoking a CBD pen at a press conference August 2016. Post-fight press conference after UFC 202. Nate Diaz had just lost a decision to Conor McGregor in their rematch. During the press conference, while answering questions, Diaz pulled out a vape pen and started smoking. Reporters asked what it was. Diaz casually said it was CBD, short for cannabidiol, a non-psychoactive compound found in cannabis. He explained it helped with inflammation and the healing process. The moment went viral. At the time, CBD was still controversial and not widely understood. Some thought Diaz was smoking marijuana in front of cameras. The UFC and athletic commissions launched an investigation, but CBD wasn't on the banned substance list. Diaz wasn't punished. The incident helped bring CBD into mainstream conversation, especially in athletic recovery. Within a few years, CBD products exploded in popularity among athletes. Diaz, intentionally or not, had normalized something that would become a multi-billion-dollar industry. The image of him casually vaping at a UFC press conference became iconic and perfectly captured his don't care attitude. Conor McGregor, throwing Monster Energy cans at Diaz at the press conference March 2016. UFC 196 press conference in Los Angeles. Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz were promoting their upcoming fight, and tensions were already high. McGregor had been talking trash for weeks. Diaz wasn't backing down. During the face-off, both fighters started shouting at each other. Then someone from Diaz's team threw a water bottle. McGregor's team threw one back. Within seconds, the stage descended into chaos. McGregor grabbed Monster Energy drink cans from the table and started hurling them at Diaz. Diaz threw bottles back. Both entourages got involved. Security rushed in. Dana White tried to restore order. The entire press conference devolved into a brawl before they'd even fought. Footage went viral immediately, generating millions of views and massive pay-per-view interest. It was pure chaos, unscripted and real. The UFC loved it because it sold the fight. The press conference became as famous as the fight itself and set a precedent for future McGregor-Diaz promotional events, which were always hostile and unpredictable. The return of Nick Diaz in 2021. September 25th, 2021, UFC 266 in Las Vegas. Nick Diaz returned to the octagon after a 6-year absence. His last fight had been in January 2015, a loss to Anderson Silva that was later overturned to a no contest after both fighters tested positive for banned substances. Diaz had been suspended for 18 months and then simply walked away. He was one of MMA's biggest cult heroes, known for his cardio, boxing, trash talk, and refusal to play by anyone's rules. Fans had begged for his return for years. When the UFC announced he'd fight Robbie Lawler, a rematch of their 2004 fight, the nostalgia was overwhelming, but the fight itself was hard to watch. Diaz looked slow, hittable, and out of place. Lawler stopped him in the 3rd round with strike. Diaz didn't look like himself. He looked like a 38-year-old who'd been out of the sport for over half a decade. After the fight, Diaz admitted he probably shouldn't have come back. It was a sad ending for a legendary career, a reminder that time catches everyone, even the most beloved fighters. Jon Jones returning at heavyweight and winning the belt March 4th, 2023, UFC 285 in Las Vegas. Jon Jones returned to the octagon after a 3-year absence, but this time at heavyweight. He'd vacated the light heavyweight title in 2020, citing a desire to move up in weight. After years of teasing the move and legal troubles that kept him sidelined, Jones finally made his heavyweight debut against Cyril Gane for the vacant championship. Gane was an elite boxer with devastating striking, considered one of the division's most technical fighters. Many wondered if Jones, who'd bulked up significantly, could handle the size and power of true heavyweight. The answer came quickly. Jones took Gane down in the 1st round and immediately went to work. Within minutes, he locked in a guillotine choke. Gane tapped at 2:04 of the 1st round. Jones became heavyweight champion in his divisional debut, cementing his case as the greatest of all time. The performance silenced doubters who thought the layoff and weight change would slow him down. Jones looked sharp, powerful, and showed his grappling translated perfectly to heavyweight. At 35 years old, he'd conquered a 2nd division and added another chapter to his controversial but undeniable legacy. Adesanya versus Pereira rivalry. Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira's rivalry didn't start in MMA. It started in kickboxing. They fought twice under kickboxing rules. Pereira won both times, including a brutal knockout in 2017. Adesanya moved to MMA and became the UFC middleweight champion, dominating the division and appearing unstoppable. Then Pereira followed him to MMA. Despite having only a few MMA fights, Pereira's striking was so elite that he quickly earned a title shot. At UFC 281 in November 2022, Pereira knocked out Adesanya in the 5th round to win the middleweight championship. It was the 3rd time Pereira had beaten Adesanya, and the psychological edge seemed insurmountable. But Adesanya refused to accept defeat. At UFC 287 in April 2023, they ran it back. This time, Adesanya came prepared. He knocked Pereira out in the 2nd round with a perfectly timed right hand, reclaiming his title, finally getting revenge. The rivalry was personal, spanning 2 sports, 3 countries. It gave fans one of the most compelling back-and-forth storylines in recent UFC history, proving that sometimes the best rivalries come from outside the octagon. Amanda Nunes destroying Ronda Rousey in under a minute. December 30th, 2016, UFC 207 in Las Vegas. Ronda Rousey was returning after a devastating knockout loss to Holly Holm over a year earlier. She'd been the face of women's MMA, the biggest star the sport had seen. But after the Holm loss, she disappeared from public life, battling depression and media scrutiny. Her comeback fight was against Amanda Nunes, the newly crowned bantamweight champion. Rousey refused to do media in the lead-up, adding to the tension. When the fight started, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Rousey came out stiff and tentative. Nunes attacked with combination punches, backing Rousey against the cage. Rousey couldn't defend. She covered up, stumbled, and ate shot after shot. The referee stopped the fight just 48 seconds into the 1st round. Rousey was finished. She left the octagon in tears and never fought again. Nunes had ended the Ronda Rousey era in less than a minute. It was a brutal, definitive passing of the torch. Nunes went on to become the greatest female fighter in MMA history, while Rousey transitioned to professional wrestling and never returned to MMA. Charles Oliveira's comeback run to the lightweight belt. For over a decade, Charles Oliveira was known as a talented but fragile fighter. He had slick submission skills, quit when things got tough. He'd been submitted himself, knocked out, and counted out as a championship-level fighter. But starting in 2018, something changed. Oliveira went on an incredible run. He moved up to lightweight and started finishing everyone. 8 straight wins, most by submission or knockout. His confidence grew. His striking improved. He stopped wilting under pressure. In May 2021, he fought Michael Chandler for the vacant lightweight title at UFC 262. Oliveira got dropped in the first round, but came back and knocked Chandler out in the second. 31 years old, after 11 years in the UFC, Oliveira finally became champion. He defended the belt successfully against Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje, submitting both. His transformation from quitter to elite champion became one of the most inspiring stories in MMA. Even after being stripped for missing weight, Oliveira continued dominating, proving his comeback wasn't luck. It was evolution. He became the most prolific submission artist and finisher in UFC history. Aljamain Sterling winning the belt via illegal knee, DQ March 6, 2021. UFC 259 in Las Vegas. Aljamain Sterling challenged Petr Yan for the bantamweight title. 3.5 rounds, Yan was dominating, controlling Sterling with striking and grappling. Sterling looked exhausted and hurt. Then, in the 4th round, with Sterling grounded on one knee, Yan threw a deliberate knee to Sterling's head. The knee was blatantly illegal under unified rules. A grounded opponent cannot be kneed to the head. The impact was flush and brutal. Sterling crumpled. The referee immediately waved off the fight and called for the doctor. After several minutes of deliberation, the referee disqualified Yan. Sterling won the bantamweight championship via disqualification. First time in UFC history, a title changed hands that way. Sterling was handed the belt, but couldn't celebrate. He was hurt, confused, and emotionally broken. Fans booed. Sterling cried. It was the worst way to win a championship. The rematch happened over a year later, with Sterling winning a controversial decision, prove he deserved the belt. But the DQ victory remains one of the strangest and most uncomfortable moments in title fight history. The birth of Fight of the Night and bonus structure. In the early 2000s, UFC fighter pay was low, and the promotion needed ways to incentivize exciting performances without raising base salaries. In 2003, the UFC introduced performance bonuses. Fighters who delivered the best fight or the best finishes would receive extra cash, typically $25,000 to $50,000 depending on the event. The categories were simple: fight of the night, knockout of the night, and submission of the night. The bonuses gave fighters motivation to take risks, go for finishes, and entertain. Over time, the bonus amounts increased, reaching $50,000 as standard and occasionally $300,000 for special events. The structure became a core part of UFC culture. Fighters would call for bonuses in post-fight interviews. Fans debated which fights deserved recognition. The system rewarded aggression and risk-taking, creating memorable moments and encouraging fighters to abandon safe game plans. Critics argue bonuses are a way to avoid paying fighters more guaranteed money, but the structure remains in place today. It's become one of the UFC's defining features, rewarding the fighters who deliver the most excitement on the biggest stages. The first stadium event in UFC history, UFC 193 Melbourne, November 14th, 2015. UFC 193 at Etihad Stadium in Melbourne, Australia. The UFC had held events in arenas worldwide, but never in a stadium. Dana White wanted to break attendance records, prove MMA could fill a venue designed for 50,000 plus fans. The main event was Ronda Rousey defending her bantamweight title against Holly Holm, former boxing champion. The fight drew 56,214 fans, shattering the previous UFC attendance record. It was a spectacle. The atmosphere was electric, the crowd deafening, but the event is remembered most for what happened in the octagon. Holm upset Rousey with a second-round head kick knockout, one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. The stadium erupted. The knockout was replayed globally. UFC 193 proved that MMA could draw massive stadium crowds and deliver historic moments. It opened the door for future stadium shows in New York, Toronto, and beyond. The event elevated the sport's profile internationally and showed that the UFC could compete with boxing and other major sports in terms of live event scale. Sean Strickland became champion in one of the biggest upsets over Adesanya, September 9th, 2023, UFC 293 in Sydney, Australia. Israel Adesanya was defending his middleweight title against Sean Strickland, a journeyman contender who'd lost his previous title eliminator. Strickland was a massive underdog, with betting odds heavily favoring Adesanya. Most analysts predicted an easy Adesanya victory. The fight started, and Strickland immediately shocked everyone. He dropped Adesanya with a right hand in the first minute, Adesanya recovered but looked tentative. For 5 rounds, Strickland pressed forward, basic, effective boxing, jabs, and straight punches. Adesanya couldn't find his rhythm. His striking looked off. His confidence seemed shaken. Strickland controlled the pace, won round after round, and cruised to a unanimous decision victory. The arena was stunned. Strickland became middleweight champion in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. Post-fight, he grabbed the mic and delivered an unfiltered rant that went viral. The win proved that even elite champions can have off night, and that pressure, consistency, and belief can overcome skill gap. Strickland's upset remains one of the most shocking title changes in modern UFC history. Joe Rogan offered to fight Wesley Snipes in the UFC in the late 1990s. Before Joe Rogan became the UFC's lead commentator, he was a stand-up comedian, actor, and martial artist with a legitimate background in Taekwondo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. At the time, actor Wesley Snipes, known for action movies like Blade, publicly claimed he was a serious martial artist with training in multiple disciplines. Rogan didn't believe him. In interviews and on his podcast years later, Rogan revealed that he challenged Snipes to an actual fight in the UFC. Rogan said he approached Dana White and offered to fight Snipes in the octagon, believing Snipes was all talk. White apparently considered it, seeing the promotional value of a celebrity fight. But Snipes never responded or accepted. The fight never happened. Rogan has joked about it since, saying he would have beaten Snipes easily and exposed him as a fraud. The story became MMA legend, a glimpse into Rogan's competitive side and his willingness to back up his word. It also showed how seriously Rogan took martial art, even before his podcast made him one of the most influential voices in combat sport. Pereira's journey in the UFC. Alex Pereira entered the UFC in 2021 with just 4 MMA fights. It was an unprecedented push for someone so inexperienced in the sport. But Pereira wasn't a typical prospect. He was a 2-time Glory kickboxing champion and had twice defeated Israel Adesanya in kickboxing, including a devastating knockout. The UFC fast-tracked him because of his striking pedigree and built-in rivalry with Adesanya, the reigning middleweight champion. Pereira knocked out Andreas Michailidis in his debut, then brutally finished Bruno Silva. 3 fights into his UFC career, he earned a title shot. In November 2022, he knocked out Adesanya to become middleweight champion. It was the fastest rise to a UFC title in modern history. Pereira defended once, then moved up to light heavyweight in 2023. At 205 pounds, he knocked out former champion Gigi Prochazka to win a second title in a different weight class. Within 2 years and 7 UFC fights, Pereira became a 2-division champion. His journey proved that elite-level striking can translate quickly to MMA, and that sometimes star power and skill can bypass traditional development timelines. Conor McGregor punched an old man in a pub August 2019. TMZ released surveillance footage from an Irish pub showing Conor McGregor offering shots of his proper number 12 whiskey to patrons at the bar. One older man, estimated to be in his 50s or 60s, refused the drink. McGregor appeared to take offense. After a brief exchange, McGregor threw a left hook, punching the man in the face. The man barely reacted, absorbing the punch and staying seated. McGregor was quickly escorted out. Footage went viral and drew widespread condemnation. McGregor was arrested and later pleaded guilty to assault. He was fined €1,000, roughly $1,100. The incident was another example of McGregor's behavior spiraling outside the octagon. He was already facing legal trouble from the Brooklyn bus attack and other incidents. The pub punch became a symbol of his decline from celebrated champion to controversial figure. McGregor later apologized, calling his actions unacceptable, but the damage was done. The image of a wealthy, famous fighter punching an elderly man in a bar became one of the most damaging moments of his career. Lady trees to jump in octagon mid-fight September 2018. UFC 229 in Las Vegas. Khabib Nurmagomedov had just submitted Conor McGregor in the main event. Post-fight chaos erupted when Khabib jumped the cage to fight McGregor's corner. While that brawl unfolded, a woman in the crowd tried to jump into the octagon. Security footage and fan videos show her attempting to climb the fence during the madness. Security quickly grabbed her and pulled her down before she could enter. Her motivation was unclear. Some speculated she was trying to break up the brawl. Others thought she was a McGregor fan trying to get involved. She was escorted out of the arena and reportedly banned from future UFC events. The incident added to the chaos of an already infamous night. UFC 229 became one of the most controversial events in history, not just for the fight, but for everything that happened after. The woman's failed cage jump became a bizarre footnote in a night defined by chaos, proving that sometimes the wildest moments happen outside the actual fight. Ngannou grew up, working in a sand mine at age 10. Francis Ngannou's story is one of the most incredible in combat sports. He grew up in Batié, Cameroon, in extreme poverty. His family had no running water or electricity. At age 10, Ngannou started working in a sand mine, hauling heavy loads for hours each day, just to help his family survive. He had little formal education and no clear path to a better life. At 26, he decided to leave Cameroon and attempt to reach Europe, hoping for opportunity. The journey took over a year. He crossed the Sahara Desert, nearly died multiple times, was imprisoned in Morocco, and eventually made it to Paris, France, homeless and broke. In Paris, he discovered MMA, started training, and showed raw, terrifying knockout power. Within a few years, he was signed to the UFC. In 2021, he became heavyweight champion by knocking out Stipe Miocic. Ngannou's rise from sand mines to UFC champion became one of the most inspirational stories in sport. He's spoken openly about his past, using his platform to inspire others facing poverty and hopelessness. His journey proves that no background is too hard to overcome with belief and relentless work. The early era, when the UFC launched in 1993, Dana White wasn't involved at all. The first fights resembled organized street brawls in tournament format. No rules, no judges, no weight classes. A fighter could be twice his opponent's size, kick him in the head while he was down, and face zero consequences. Royce Gracie became the UFC's breakout star by submitting Jimerson, Shamrock, and Gordeau to win the inaugural tournament. Ken Shamrock started gaining traction in later events, but Gracie stayed dominant, winning 2 of the first 3 tournaments. In 1995, the UFC introduced its first singles bout between Gracie and Shamrock. The highly anticipated matchup disappointed fans. It dragged on for 36 minutes with minimal action, drew heavy boos, and ended in a draw. That controversial result triggered major changes. Time limits were implemented. Judges were brought in to settle draws. Referees gained authority to stand fighters up when action stalled. This period laid the groundwork for the sport, with Gracie and Shamrock at the forefront. The Dark Era. In 1996, the UFC faced a major image crisis. With almost no regulations and brutal finishes, it was viewed by many as excessively violent. Senator John McCain labeled it human cockfighting and launched a campaign to shut it down. His efforts succeeded. The UFC was banned in over 30 states, dropped from cable television, and left struggling. The company hemorrhaged money and faded from relevance. But instead of folding, the UFC evolved. They began modifying rules to make the sport safer and more credible. In 1997, UFC 12 introduced weight classes. That same night, a young Vitor Belfort debuted. Shortly after, gloves became required, and dangerous techniques like headbutts and strikes to the back of the head were prohibited. As Royce Gracie stepped away, new fighters like Randy Couture and Tito Ortiz entered and climbed the ranks. In 2000, the UFC partnered with state athletic commissions to gain official sanctioning. California became the first to approve unified MMA rules, with New Jersey following quickly. Other states began approving events, and the UFC slowly rebuilt credibility. UFC 28 became the first fully sanctioned event under these regulations, and featured the only super heavyweight bout in UFC history, won by Josh Barnett via TKO. Despite these improvements, the UFC remained in serious financial trouble. Owners invested millions into events, but saw no return. By late 2000, the company was drowning in debt and close to shutting down permanently. This period was pure survival, battling bans, bleeding money, and teetering on the edge. The modern era. The modern era started in January 2001, when Zuffa LLC, a company formed by Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, with Dana White as president, bought the UFC for $2 million. That year, they began rebuilding by working with state athletic commissions and securing sanctioning in Nevada and New Jersey. This allowed the UFC to return to pay-per-view and rebuild its audience. By 2002, Tito Ortiz, the light heavyweight champion, fought Ken Shamrock in a super fight and won when Shamrock's corner stopped the bout. In 2003, a rivalry formed between Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell, with Randy scoring an upset TKO. For Chuck, the story with Randy wasn't finished. That year, Nick Diaz also made an impressive UFC debut, winning via armbar. The momentum continued into 2004 when BJ Penn shocked everyone by submitting Matt Hughes to capture the welterweight title. Months later, Chuck Liddell knocked out Tito Ortiz in the second round of their anticipated clash. The year closed with Matt Hughes submitting GSP in his first title attempt. Despite better fights and emerging talent, the UFC continued losing millions. But 2005 changed everything with The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show on Spike TV. It exploded. The season finale featuring Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar delivered one of MMA's most memorable fights and drew fans in unprecedented numbers. By 2006, Chuck Liddell returned and knocked out Randy Couture twice, becoming the UFC's face. That year, MMA legend Royce Gracie returned after 11 years, but Matt Hughes quickly ended the comeback with a TKO. Pay-per-view numbers skyrocketed. Tito Ortiz defeated Ken Shamrock twice consecutively, but soon Tito fell victim when Chuck stopped him via TKO. Around the same time, Matt Hughes avenged his loss to BJ Penn with a TKO, only to get knocked out himself when GSP landed a devastating head GOAT era. By 2007, the seemingly unstoppable GSP was shocked by Matt Serra, who stopped him via TKO to claim the welterweight belt. That year, Quinton Rampage Jackson debuted in the UFC and knocked out Chuck Liddell to end his championship reign. Meanwhile, Anderson Silva was tearing through the middleweight division, making it look effortless. In 2008, GSP returned with a point to prove. He dominated Matt Serra in the rematch, winning via TKO and reclaiming his belt. It marked the start of one of the UFC's most dominant championship runs. BJ Penn captured the lightweight title by submitting Joe Stevenson at UFC 80. At UFC 81, Brock Lesnar made his hype debut. Frank Mir derailed the momentum by finishing him with a knee bar. A young John Jones also quietly debuted, winning his first bout by decision. 2009 delivered a huge champion versus champion clash. BJ Penn moved up to challenge GSP, but GSP dominated, and Penn's corner stopped it after round 4. At UFC 98, Lyoto Machida knocked out Rashad Evans to become light heavyweight champion while still undefeated. That wouldn't last. Then came UFC 100, the biggest event in UFC history to that point. Lesnar avenged his loss to Frank Mir with a brutal TKO and became undisputed heavyweight champion. GSP outclassed Thiago Alves, and Dan Henderson delivered an iconic knockout over Michael Bisping. The momentum carried into 2010. GSP continued his dominance with clean wins over Dan Hardy and Josh Koscheck. Anderson Silva dominating at middleweight, but Machida's unbeaten streak ended when Shogun Rua stopped him via TKO. Frankie Edgar defeated BJ Penn twice to become the new lightweight champion. The torch was passed. Brock Lesnar also handed the torch to undefeated Cain Velasquez after a first-round TKO loss at UFC 121. On October 28, 2010, the UFC merged with the WEC, adding bantamweight and featherweight division. This era saw the rise of all-time greats and a sharp increase in mainstream popularity. Popular era. On August 18, 2011, the UFC signed a 7-year deal with Fox, bringing MMA to mainstream network television in the US. The first event featured Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos. It ended in 64 seconds with Dos Santos knocking out Cain to become heavyweight champion. At UFC 128, John Jones made history. At only 23 years old, he completely dominated Mauricio Shogun Rua to become the youngest UFC champion ever. From there, John entered his prime and demolished everyone in his path. Meanwhile, UFC 137 delivered a gritty bout between BJ Penn and Nick Diaz. Diaz won, and unfortunately, it started a losing streak for BJ that he never recovered from. By 2012, Dana White confirmed women would compete in the UFC. The first signee was Ronda Rousey, the Strikeforce bantamweight champion and rising star. Cain Velasquez got revenge on Dos Santos at UFC 105, reclaiming his belt with a dominant showing. Anderson Silva continued his reign, beating Chael Sonnen again. But 2013 brought a shock. Silva, who hadn't lost in years and was on a 17-fight win streak, got knocked out by Chris Weidman at UFC 162. In the rematch at UFC 168, things got worse. Silva broke his leg throwing and Weidman retained. Around this time, Cain and Dos Santos fought for the third and final time. Cain won again, ending their trilogy. GSP retired in 2013 after victories over Nick Diaz and Johnny Hendrick, leaving with an incredible 12-fight win streak. In 2014, Conor McGregor started grabbing attention with flashy knockouts and trash talk. Simultaneously, Ronda Rousey continued dominating, finishing Alexis Davis in just 16 seconds. That year also saw TJ Dillashaw pull off a massive upset, delivering an incredible performance to dethrone Renan Barão and win the title. Then in 2015, one of the biggest rivalries ever began. John Jones versus Daniel Cormier. Jones won their first fight by decision, but their story was far from over. At UFC 189, Conor delivered a standout showing, claiming the interim title with a TKO over Chad Mendes. Later that year, he knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds to become featherweight champion. His knockout power and mic skills brought massive revenue for himself in the UFC. Holly Holm became a star overnight at UFC 193 when she shocked the world with a head kick knockout, handing Ronda Rousey her first loss. This era was about creating megastars like Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey. The Golden Age 2016 opened with a shocker. Nate Diaz stunned the world by submitting Conor McGregor in round 2. But Conor got revenge later that year at UFC 202, winning a brutal 5-round war by majority decision. He wasn't alone in getting revenge. Michael Bisping, fighting with one good eye, knocked out Luke Rockhold in their rematch to win the middleweight title. At UFC 200, a new star emerged. Amanda Nunes stopped Miesha Tate to become women's bantamweight champion. Months later, she ended Ronda Rousey's fighting career with a first-round knockout. Conor closed 2016 by making history, dominating Eddie Alvarez to become the UFC's first simultaneous two-division champion. In 2017, GSP returned after 4 years, moved to middleweight, and submitted Michael Bisping at UFC 217 to win the title. Shortly after, GSP vacated and retired again. Earlier that year, heated Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier rivalry continued with Jones winning by knockout at UFC 214, though the result was overturned due to a failed drug test. Meanwhile, Max Holloway was rolling. On a 10-fight win streak, finished Jose Aldo twice to become featherweight champion. 2018 was another milestone year. Daniel Cormier made history by knocking out Stipe Miocic at UFC 226 to become the second simultaneous two-division champion. Then came the biggest UFC fight ever, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor for the lightweight title. Khabib won, and the fight became the highest-selling UFC pay-per-view ever with 2.4 million buys. By late 2018, Amanda Nunes joined the Double Champ Club, knocking out Chris Cyborg in under a minute to become women's featherweight champion. In 2019, Israel Adesanya broke through as a superstar. He delivered a Fight of the Year performance against Kelvin Gastelum, then knocked out Robert Whittaker at UFC 243 to claim the middleweight belt. Jorge Masvidal also exploded in popularity that year with a knockout over Darren Till, a record-breaking 5-second flying knee knockout on Ben Askren at UFC 239, and a dominant victory over Nat Diaz at UFC 244 to earn the BMF title. At UFC 241, Stipe Miocic reclaimed the heavyweight title from DC with a 4th-round TKO. To cap 2019, Kamaru Usman defeated rival Colby Covington in a 5-round war at UFC 245. This era was the golden age of the UFC, witnessing the rise of its biggest stars, record-breaking pay-per-views, multiple double champions, and global expansion elevated MMA to an entirely new level. The COVID era. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shut down global sport, but UFC President Dana White refused to pause. The UFC quickly adapted, creating Fight Island in Abu Dhabi to host international fighters unable to enter the US, while US events took place in Jacksonville and Las Vegas, all without audiences. At UFC 251, Kamaru Usman shut down Jorge Masvidal's momentum, winning by decision to defend his welterweight title. Later that summer at UFC 252, Stipe and Daniel settled their trilogy. Stipe won by decision and solidified his legacy as the greatest UFC heavyweight ever. Soon after, undefeated middleweights Israel Adesanya and Paulo Costa clashed. Adesanya dominated, finishing Costa via TKO in round 2. July 2020 saw a new star arrive. Khamzat Chimaev fought and won twice in 10 days with devastating finishes. He closed the year with a second knockout, going 3-0 in his debut year. But Kevin Holland went further, racking up 5 wins in 2020, stealing the spotlight. That year, Khabib submitted Justin Gaethje in round 2 and retired undefeated. Another legend, Anderson Silva, also retired in 2020. 2021 started with Dustin Poirier knocking out Conor McGregor at UFC 257, 2021, handing Conor his first knockout loss. They met again months later for a trilogy, but the fight ended tragically for Conor after he broke his leg at the end of round 1. At UFC 259, Adesanya attempted to become a two-division champion, fell short against Jan Blachowicz, who used size and grappling to win by decision. Events later, Jorge Masvidal got his rematch with Usman. This time, Usman knocked him out cold, handing Masvidal his first knockout loss. Khabib retired, Charles Oliveira stepped up. He fought Michael Chandler for the vacant lightweight title at UFC 262 and won via second-round TKO. Just one event later, Brandon Moreno made history by submitting Davison Figueiredo to become the first Mexican-born UFC champion. Francis Ngannou closed the year with a brutal knockout over Stipe, claiming the heavyweight title. This era was quieter due to empty arenas full of excitement. New stars like Kamaru Usman, Israel Adesanya, and Charles Oliveira rose to dominance. The new era. Leon Edwards began 2022 spectacularly by knocking out Kamaru Usman with a head kick in the final minute, becoming welterweight champion. At UFC 280, UFC, Charles Oliveira passed the torch to Islam Makhachev, who submitted him in round 2 to claim the lightweight title. Months later, Islam defended his belt in a 5-round war against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 284, winning by unanimous decision. When they met again, Volkanovski stepped in on short notice, but Makhachev finished quickly with a first-round head kick knockout. Meanwhile, Alex Pereira shocked the world by knocking out Israel Adesanya in round 5 to take the middleweight title, but Adesanya got revenge months later, knocking out Pereira to reclaim the middleweight belt. In March 2023, Jon Jones returned after 3 years and made his heavyweight debut at UFC 285, easily submitting Cyril Gane in round 1 to become a 2-division champion. That night, history was made in women's flyweight as Alexa Grasso submitted longtime champion Valentina Shevchenko in round 4. Their rematch ended in a draw, but in the trilogy, Shevchenko reclaimed her title by decision. Sean O'Malley lived up to hype in 2023, knocking out Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292 to become bantamweight champion. To close 2023, Sean Strickland outclassed Adesanya over 5 rounds and won the middleweight title by unanimous decision. Strickland defended at UFC 297 against Dricus du Plessis, but lost via split decision, making Dricus the new middleweight champion. Shortly after, Alexander Volkanovski's long reign ended when Ilia Topuria knocked him out in round 2 to claim the featherweight belt. April 2024 delivered UFC 300, one of the greatest cards in UFC history. Alex Pereira knocked out Jamahal Hill with his trademark left hook, and Max Holloway delivered a legendary performance, knocking out Justin Gaethje in a fight fans will never forget. UFC 302 introduced Golden Champion gloves, and that night, Islam Makhachev showcased dominance again by submitting Dustin Poirier in round 5. Shortly after, Adesanya hunted to reclaim the title from Dricus, but Dricus retained after submitting Adesanya. At UFC 306, Merab Dvalishvili became the new bantamweight king after a dominant showing against Sean O'Malley. History was made at UFC 308 when Ilia Topuria became the first fighter to knock out Max Holloway. Earlier that night, Khamzat Chimaev made a huge statement by submitting Robert Whittaker in round 1. In the following event, John returned and dominated Stipe Miocic, winning via TKO in round 3. After the fight, Stipe officially announced retirement. He wasn't alone. This era also marked retirements of other UFC legends like Amanda Nunes, Jose Aldo, Luke Rockhold, Jorge Masvidal, and Donald Cerrone. As many greats stepped away, a new generation began rising. Fighters like Paddy Pimblett, Rainier de Ridder, Ian Gary, and Shavkat Rakhmonov started making names for themselves. This era was about rising stars taking over, unexpected title changes, and future legends making their mark. It delivered some of the most exciting super fights and unforgettable debuts in recent memory. UFC 232 venue change controversy. The UFC 232 situation remains one of the wildest moments in the promotion's history. The event was originally scheduled for Las Vegas in 2018, with Jon Jones facing Alexander Gustafsson in a highly anticipated rematch. Just days before the fight, Jones failed a drug test showing trace amounts of a steroid metabolite from previous use. The Nevada State Athletic Commission refused to clear him, citing insufficient time to properly review the case during the holiday season. Dana White's solution? He relocated the entire event to California with less than a week's notice. The California State Athletic Commission quickly approved Jones to compete, and the show went on. The decision created absolute pandemonium. Ticket holders and fans who'd already traveled to Vegas were left stranded. Every fighter on the card had to scramble to rearrange travel plans, training schedules, and accommodate last-minute logistical nightmares. Many couldn't bring their full camps due to the abrupt change. Jones simply showed up, fought, and reclaimed his championship. The preferential treatment was impossible to ignore. Any other fighter would have seen their bout canceled immediately, but Jones's star power changed the rules. As one affected fighter said, the situation was frustrating and costly for everyone except Jones himself. Brock Lesnar's USADA exemption at UFC 200 faced major headlining problems when Jon Jones was removed for a doping violation and Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 2 fell through. The UFC needed a massive draw and turned to Brock Lesnar. The controversial part? They waived the standard 6-month USADA testing period required for returning fighters. Lesnar competed against Mark Hunt and won, but subsequently failed his post-fight drug test for estrogen blockers. These substances are typically used after steroid cycles to normalize hormone levels and mask side effects. Presence strongly suggests prior steroid use. Performance-enhancing drugs provide enormous advantages: increased strength, accelerated recovery, and elevated pain tolerance. This allows users to strike harder and absorb more damage without deteriorating. Clean opponents. This creates an extremely dangerous situation that can result in severe, or even fatal injuries. Despite widespread knowledge of Lesnar's likely drug use, the UFC allowed the fight to proceed for financial gain. Mark Hunt was so outraged, he filed a lawsuit against Lesnar, the UFC, and Dana White, alleging they knowingly permitted a performance-enhanced fighter to compete. Case was ultimately dismissed, and Hunt was ordered to cover a portion of the UFC's legal expenses. Vitor Belfort's TRT era. During the early 2000s, Vitor Belfort on testosterone replacement therapy was absolutely terrifying. He looked like something out of a video game, incredibly shredded and throwing head kicks with the speed of punches. Power was devastating, including the kick that damaged Michael Bisping's eye, ultimately costing him his vision in that eye. At the time, TRT was completely legal, approved by both the UFC and athletic commissions for fighters with medically low testosterone levels. While intended as legitimate medical treatment, Belfort maximized the system's benefits and transformed into a superhuman version of himself. Eventually, the realization set in that TRT wasn't creating fair competition. It was producing enhanced athletes. As criticism mounted, the UFC banned TRT entirely in 2014. Post-ban Belfort looked dramatically different, resembling an average middle-aged fitness enthusiast rather than an elite destroyer. Power, speed, and explosiveness vanished. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Chris Weidman dominated him easily. This version of Belfort was barely recognizable compared to his TRT-enhanced form. GSP's Vaseline controversy, Greasegate. Georges St-Pierre has consistently maintained one of the cleanest reputations in UFC history. No failed drug tests, no scandals, just discipline and professionalism. That spotless image faced its only serious challenge during his UFC 94 rematch, BJ Penn. BJ Penn's team accused GSP's corner of applying Vaseline to his chest and shoulders between rounds, making him more difficult to grapple and neutralizing Penn's Brazilian jiu-jitsu from bottom position. Video evidence appeared to support this claim. Footage clearly shows GSP's cornerman applying Vaseline to his face, standard practice for preventing cuts, but then also rubbing it on his shoulders and back, which violates regulations. The fight continued regardless. GSP performed excellently and finished Penn in the fourth round. The Athletic Commission conducted a review afterward, but didn't overturn the result. GSP's explanation attributed everything to a breathing technique his team routinely used, denying any intentional rule breaking. Penn has never accepted this explanation. He maintains to this day that the fight was unfair, and that he was denied a legitimate opportunity to compete on equal terms. Ariel Helwani's lifetime ban. At UFC 199, veteran MMA journalist Ariel Helwani was ejected from the event and hit with a lifetime ban, all for practicing journalism. Helwani discovered that the UFC was secretly planning Brock Lesnar's return at UFC 200, a massive surprise they intended to reveal dramatically during the pay-per-view broadcast. Since everyone believed Lesnar had retired to focus on WWE, this was genuinely huge news. Before the UFC could make their official announcement, Helwani published the story on his platform. Dana White's reaction was explosive. Rather than accepting it as standard journalism, he confronted Helwani, berated him publicly, had him removed from the arena, and imposed a lifetime ban from all UFC events. No credentials, no access, nothing. The MMA community rallied behind Helwani immediately. Fighters, fans, fellow journalists recognized it as Dana attempting to control media coverage the same way he controls the organization. The backlash became so intense that the UFC eventually reversed the ban, but Dana has never forgiven him. Years later, their feud continued, Dana regularly disparaging Helwani despite his professional conduct. James Krause, betting scandal. James Krause, formerly respected as a UFC veteran and coach, became the central figure in one of MMA's most significant betting scandals. In 2022, his fighter Derek Minner entered the octagon with an injury known only to Krause and Minner. Minutes before the bout, unusual betting activity occurred, with large wagers predicting Minner would lose quickly. That's exactly what transpired. Minner threw a single kick, injured his leg, and the fight ended shortly after. Investigators discovered Krause operated a private Discord server where he shared betting advice, even claiming he earned more from betting than from coaching or fighting. The UFC immediately suspended Krause and banned any fighter training with him from competition. The situation escalated in 2025 when flyweight Jeff Molina, one of Krause's top students, received a 3-year suspension. Evidence revealed Molina knew about Minner's injury beforehand and bet on the fight without disclosing it to the commission, a serious regulatory violation. Krause now claims to be millions in debt and pursuing real estate ventures for income. Federal investigation remains active, with potential additional charges forthcoming. UFC 167 judging controversy. At UFC 167, GSP defended his welterweight title against Johnny Hendricks in what remains one of the sport's most controversial controversial decisions. GSP won by split decision officially, but watching the actual fight tells a different story. Hendricks appeared to dominate, landing harder shots, rocking GSP, cutting him open, and controlling much of the action. While GSP had some successful moments, Hendricks clearly inflicted more damage throughout. Most observers felt Hendricks won at least 3 rounds, possibly 4. All 16 major MMA media outlets scored the bout for Hendricks. Even Dana White, who had every incentive to support GSP as the UFC's biggest star, expressed shock that GSP won. The decision remains heavily debated in MMA circles. Many believe GSP received favorable judging that night. Daniel Cormier's double championship journey. Daniel Cormier began his UFC career at heavyweight, remaining undefeated while using his Olympic wrestling credentials to dominate opponents. However, his teammate Cain Velasquez held the heavyweight championship. Out of loyalty and unwillingness to compete against his friend, DC moved down to light heavyweight. At 205 pounds, he appeared dominant, defeating fighters like Dan Henderson and Pat Cummins. He earned his first title opportunity against John Jones in 2015, but lost the bout. Months later, Jones faced legal issues and was stripped of the championship, creating a vacancy. DC received another opportunity, this time against Anthony Rumble Johnson. Despite Johnson landing heavy early strikes that nearly finished him, DC maintained composure and employed his wrestling. He sustained pressure and exhausted Rumble. By the 3rd round, Johnson was depleted, allowing DC to take his back and secure a rear naked choke to capture the light heavyweight championship. He successfully defended the belt multiple times before a Jones rematch. Jones knocked him out, but subsequently failed a drug test, causing the result to be overturned to a no contest. DC retained his championship. In 2018, DC returned to heavyweight to challenge Stipe Miocic, considered the greatest UFC heavyweight at that time. DC knocked him out in the 1st round, making history as the 2nd fighter to simultaneously hold 2 UFC championships. Henry Cejudo's underrated double championship run. Henry Cejudo's double championship achievement remains one of UFC history's most underappreciated accomplishments. Initially perceived primarily as a wrestler, admittedly an exceptional one, having won Olympic gold and becoming the youngest American wrestler to achieve that feat until 2024. In the UFC, he needed to prove himself against elite strikers and top-tier competition. He started at flyweight with a 4-0 record before facing Demetrius Johnson, the seemingly invincible long-reigning champion. Henry lost that 1st-round encounter, leading many to dismiss his championship potential. Instead of fading, he significantly improved and earned a rematch 2 years later. At UFC 227, Henry pulled off a major upset, winning a close decision and ending Demetrius Johnson's legendary 6-year title reign. He became the new flyweight champion. He didn't stop there. He moved to bantamweight to challenge Marlon Moraes for the vacant title. Early in the fight, things looked grim as Moraes punished him with leg kicks, but Henry persevered, increased his pace, and completely overwhelmed Moraes with relentless pressure and toughness. He finished him in the 3rd round, becoming the 4th fighter in UFC history to hold 2 championships simultaneously. The remarkable aspect is that he actually defended both titles, something few double champions accomplish. He defeated TJ Dillashaw at flyweight and defended the bantamweight championship against Dominic Cruz before retiring at the peak of his career. BJ Penn's prodigy path to double champion. BJ Penn's double championship journey was extraordinary, and truly no one has matched his unique path. He wasn't simply talented, he was a genuine prodigy. He became the first American to win gold at the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship as a black belt after only a few years of training, earning him the nickname Prodigy. He entered MMA with minimal professional experience, yet immediately made an impact. After just 3 UFC fights, he received a lightweight title shot but lost. Then unexpectedly, he moved to welterweight and challenged the dominant champion Matt Hughes. BJ shocked the world by submitting Hughes in the 1st round to become UFC welterweight champion. Here's where things get interesting. Immediately after winning the belt, BJ departed the UFC over a contract dispute and competed in other organizations. He didn't return for years. Upon his return, he dropped back to lightweight where he truly flourished. He dominated Joe Stevenson to capture the lightweight belt, then successfully defended against top contenders like Sean Shirk, Kenny Florian, and Diego Sanchez. During that run, BJ looked unstoppable with sharp boxing, world-class grappling, incredible flexibility, and a warrior's mentality. While his later career record suffered, BJ became only the 2nd fighter in UFC history to win championships in 2 weight classes, accomplishing it before weight jumping became commonplace. Randy Couture's age-defying championship. Among everyone on this list, Randy Couture deserves exceptional recognition. He didn't begin MMA until his mid-30s, quickly made up for lost time. He was already an accomplished Greco-Roman wrestler, and upon entering the UFC, he used that wrestling to control and exhaust opponents. During an era when the sport was still evolving, Randy adapted perfectly. He won the UFC Heavyweight Championship in just his 4th professional fight. The remarkable aspect was his constant size disadvantage at heavyweight, facing significantly larger opponents, yet still succeeding. He lost the belt relatively quickly, but recaptured it, establishing a career pattern of losses, followed by championship redemptions. A pivotal moment came when he dropped to light heavyweight. There, Randy challenged Chuck Liddell, who was on a dominant streak known for knockout power, but Randy outworked him, landed punishing strikes, and secured a TKO victory. He then faced Tito Ortiz and dominated that bout as well, and he still wasn't finished. At 43 years old, Randy returned to heavyweight and challenged Tim Sylvia for the championship. Sylvia was substantially bigger and younger. Nearly everyone predicted Randy had no chance, but he controlled all 5 rounds and captured the heavyweight title for the 3rd time, proving age is irrelevant for exceptional fighters like him. Rico Rodriguez versus Randy Couture, a tattoo that almost killed the UFC. This fight nearly destroyed the UFC. During the organization's early struggling days, the company was barely surviving financially and couldn't afford any significant mistake. UFC 39 was critically important, headlined by Rico Rodriguez versus Randy Couture at the Mohegan Sun Casino. Everything proceeded normally until Dana White noticed Rico's back. Rico had applied a massive temporary tattoo reading Golden Palace, a competing online casino. The UFC had no sponsorship relationship with them, and worse, the event was taking place inside Mohegan Sun, a direct Golden Palace competitor. Dana was trying to execute a successful event and sell tickets while his headliner essentially served as a walking advertisement for a rival business. Dana exploded. They threatened to cancel the entire event over that tattoo. No crowd, no pay-per-view, no revenue. At that time, the UFC couldn't withstand such a blow. If this card got canceled, the company might not have survived. Dana needed an immediate solution. He likely paid money under the table and made numerous promises to appease the casino. Whatever strategy they employed worked. The fight proceeded, Rico won, and the giant fake tattoo remained. But Dana never forgot. Years later on a podcast, he discussed it with obvious lingering irritation. This wasn't merely a stupid stunt. It was something that could have completely eliminated the UFC, all because a fighter wanted some quick cash from a gambling site. Kimbo Slice versus Seth Petrozelli, the knockout that buried Elite XC. This incident still infuriates Dana White. In 2008, MMA was rapidly growing. Everyone wanted involvement, including a promotion called Elite XC. Their major star was Kimbo Slice, the backyard fighting legend turned professional. Elite XC secured a massive deal with CBS Sports and made Kimbo their centerpiece. Their strategy was transforming him into a mainstream star, and it was genuinely working. Millions wanted to see him compete. Then fight night arrived. Kimbo was scheduled to face Ken Shamrock, but Ken suffered an injury the day of the event, so Seth Petrozelli stepped in on short notice. Kimbo was expected to dominate him easily, but instead got knocked out in just 14 seconds. Things deteriorated further when Seth revealed post-fight that promoters instructed him not to take Kimbo down, essentially encouraging him to keep the fight standing. That strategy backfired catastrophically. Kimbo got knocked out. That's when Dana White went nuclear. He delivered a legendary rant condemning Elite XC and what he perceived as illegal behavior, stating, "That's illegal." He wasn't merely trash talking. Dana genuinely believed these types of stunts could destroy the entire sport and damage the UFC by association. He'd spent years working to legitimize MMA and earn respect. Then this rival promotion staged what looked like a circus, potentially rigging fights and making the entire sport appear fraudulent. Dana used every available platform, interviews, podcasts, to demolish Elite XC's credibility. Sure enough, the promotion collapsed shortly afterward. They entered wanting a piece of the market without caring if they destroyed the whole sport. John Fitch versus Josh Berkman, Steve Mazzagotti's worst moment. Even though this fight occurred outside the UFC, it still triggered Dana White. At World Series of Fighting 3, Josh Berkman faced John Fitch. Berkman secured a tight choke, and Fitch lost consciousness. The referee, Steve Mazzagotti, just stood there. Instead of intervening immediately, he watched. Berkman literally released the choke and stood up before the ref took any action. Fitch lay there unconscious while Mazzagotti looked completely lost. Dana already had a history of criticizing Mazzagotti, but this was the breaking point. Dana ranted for approximately 10 minutes straight, calling him the worst referee in the sport. He even said, "Look, he might be a nice guy. He might even save orphans on the weekends, but he's a terrible ref." laugh. Dana wasn't wrong. Watching that fight, Mazzagatti genuinely appears to have no idea where he is or what's happening. Even though this wasn't a UFC event, Dana used the moment to make a larger point. He called out the Nevada State Athletic Commission, demanding they improve their standards and stop assigning him to high-level fights. After that rant, Mazzagatti essentially disappeared. He had a couple more UFC appearances, then he was finished. Anderson Silva versus Demian Maia, the Abu Dhabi embarrassment. This might represent the angriest Dana White has ever been during a fight, and not due to anything illegal or a bad decision. It was simply a boring fight at the worst possible time. UFC 112 was the promotion's first ever event in Abu Dhabi. It was a significant moment for the company. New territory, high-level guests, and substantial pressure to deliver an excellent show. They scheduled Anderson Silva, the UFC's most dominant and entertaining champion, against Demian Maia. Everyone expected an exciting fight, but instead received 5 rounds of Anderson just fooling around. He danced, dropped his hands, mocked Maia, and essentially avoided doing anything serious. After the second round, crowd started booing and chanting Maia's name. Dana White was so furious, he literally walked out of the arena before the fight ended and told Anderson's manager to put the belt on him. It's a UFC tradition for Dana to wrap the belt around the champion's waist, but he was too angry to do it this time. In post-fight interviews, Dana unleashed. He said it was a disgrace and that Anderson acted like a loser. He even immediately shut down all GSP versus Anderson super fight talk. In his words, Anderson doesn't deserve it right now. When asked if this was his lowest moment as UFC president, he responded, "No doubt about it. Absolutely. 100%. Chuck Liddell versus Taito Ortiz 3. Fight that should never happen. This fight didn't occur in the UFC, but still pushed Dana White to his limit. In 2018, Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy MMA organized Chuck vs. Tito 3. From the beginning, Dana made clear this was a fight that should never have happened. Chuck Liddell wasn't just a UFC legend, he was one of Dana's closest friends. By 2010, after suffering several brutal knockouts, Dana intervened and forced him to retire. He was concerned about Chuck's health and gave him a comfortable UFC job just to keep him away from fighting. For years, Chuck remained retired until Oscar De La Hoya came calling. Chuck had already defeated Tito twice. The rivalry was finished. But Oscar somehow convinced Chuck to fight Tito a third time, 8 years after Chuck's last fight, and now nearly 50 years old. It was an obvious cash grab and Dana recognized it. He didn't hold back, calling Oscar a cokehead and saying that anyone allowing Chuck to fight at this point wasn't his friend. Then the fight happened, and it was heartbreaking. Chuck looked like a shadow of his former self, slow, stiff, and clearly diminished. Tito knocked him out in the first round. It was painful to watch. For Dana, personal. After the fight, Dana went on a comprehensive media offensive. He destroyed Oscar's promotion, slammed the California State Athletic Commission for sanctioning the fight, and said everyone involved should be ashamed. He even revealed Chuck made more money staying retired under the UFC than he got paid to get knocked out. Tito Ortiz versus Forrest Griffin, the bizarre retirement fight. This wasn't about bad judging or a wild finish. It was just straight up bizarre behavior. And if there's one thing Dana White can't tolerate, it's fighters doing strange things live on a major pay-per-view. At UFC 148, Tito Ortiz was having his retirement fight against Forrest Griffin, their third encounter with high emotion. When the final bell rang, Forrest wasn't satisfied with his performance. Instead of waiting for the judges to announce the winner, he simply walked out of the cage. Dana wasn't having it. He literally chased Forrest down and forced him to return to the octagon. Griffin returned and, to his own surprise, won by unanimous decision. You'd think the drama would end there, but no. Instead of allowing Tito his significant retirement moment, Forrest grabbed the microphone from Joe Rogan and started interviewing Tito himself. What should have been an emotional farewell turned into this confusing moment that made no sense to anyone watching. Backstage, Dana exploded. He called Forrest's actions professional suicide and said, "If you're upset about how you fought, cry after. Don't just leave." Dana made clear he wasn't finished talking to Forrest about this. McGregor assassination attempt. UFC 229. McGregor versus Khabib. Conor McGregor lost that fight. Khabib dominated him for 4 rounds before securing a 4th round submission. But according to whispers from inside the UFC, McGregor might have been lucky to make it to the cage at all. Hours before the biggest fight of his life, something happened backstage. Something serious enough that UFC commentator John Anik referenced rumblings on his podcast days later. Something that made co-host Kenny Florian admit that he would have changed his bet against McGregor if he'd known about it beforehand. They never said what it was. they couldn't or wouldn't. But other details started emerging. Islam Makhachev, Khabib's teammate, was allegedly seen making finger gun gestures at McGregor in the hours leading up to the fight. Not playful, not joking, threatening. Then came the bombshell. An unidentified individual was reportedly arrested inside the T-Mobile Arena for having a firearm. Not in the crowd, inside the restricted backstage area. The arena where fighters, coaches, and cornermen prepared. The area where Conor McGregor was getting ready for the biggest fight of his career. The incident was allegedly so serious that UFC officials considered canceling the entire event. UFC 229, the most anticipated fight in company history, nearly canceled due to safety concerns. Think about what that means. The UFC doesn't cancel events. They've run shows during pandemics in empty arenas across the globe under impossible circumstances. For them to even consider pulling the plug on their biggest pay-per-view of all time, something catastrophic must have been unfolding behind those doors. Joe Rogan addressed it on his podcast shortly after. During an episode with Justin Wren, he brought up an article about a gunman trying to get into the back of the arena. Then he moved on. Quickly, almost too quickly, like someone who knew more than he was allowed to say. When Islam Makhachev allegedly made those finger gun gestures at McGregor, was he joking around? Or was he sending a message? You can take steroids if you snitch. USADA. Since 2015, they've been the ones testing UFC fighters, catching cheaters, and supposedly keeping the sport clean. But what if the system isn't about catching cheaters at all? What if it's about controlling who gets caught? There's a theory that's been circulating in MMA circles for years. A theory that makes fans, fighters, and even some coaches uncomfortable because of how much sense it makes. The theory is simple. If you cooperate with USADA, you give them information about other fighters using performance-enhancing drugs, you get a pass. You can keep using steroids. You can keep cheating, as long as you're useful to them. Sounds crazy? Here's the thing. It's not entirely a conspiracy theory. It's actually written into USADA's rules. Article 10.6.1, substantial assistance. It's right there in the UFC's anti-doping policy. The clause explicitly states that a fighter's suspension can be reduced or even completely eliminated if they provide useful information. That leads to uncovering another athlete's doping violation or exposing someone who supplied or facilitated performance-enhancing drugs. Complete elimination of a suspension. Zero punishment for providing information. So while that idea that you can take steroids if you snitch sounds like something from a Reddit forum, it's based on real policy that USADA uses. A policy that creates a massive incentive for fighters to cooperate, rat out their competition, and potentially continue using themselves while staying under USADA's protection. Look at the pattern. Fighters get popped for PEDs, major names, guys who were championship contenders, and then, mysteriously, their suspensions get reduced, sometimes from years down to months, sometimes almost to nothing. Fixed UFC fights. Right now, the UFC is actively investigating a massive sports betting scandal involving UFC fights. What triggered the investigation was a fight between Isaac Dolgarian and Yair Deval. Dolgarian lost via rear naked choke, but here's the thing. He didn't even try to defend it. A professional MMA fighter that apparently didn't know how to defend a choke. Something was wrong. Along with that fishiness, heavy money went on his opponent to win by first round finish. After that, reports broke that federal authorities were looking into suspicious betting patterns surrounding multiple UFC events. Unusual spikes in wagers on heavy underdogs. Massive money pouring in on specific outcomes minutes before the fights. Bets being placed by people connected to fighters, coaches, and cornermen. The kind of patterns that only appear when someone knows something they shouldn't. Some estimates put out the number of compromised UFC fights at over 100. 100 fights. Think about that. And here's where it gets even darker. Referees might be involved. Jason Herzog, one of the most experienced referees in the sport, according to some sources, is being investigated by the FBI as well. UFC 279 was staged. September 10th, 2022, UFC 279. Nate Diaz's final fight in the UFC. His farewell bout against rising star Khamzat Chimaev. What should have been a straightforward send-off turned into one of the most chaotic 24 hours in UFC history. Within minutes of weigh-ins, fans were convinced the whole thing was staged. Weigh-in day. Khamzat Chimaev steps on the scale. 178 102.5 pounds for a welterweight fight with a 170-pound limit. He missed weight by 8.5 pounds. Not a pound, not 2 pounds. 8.5 pounds. That's not missing weight. That's showing up for a completely different fight. The UFC went into crisis mode. Press conferences canceled, media obligations scrapped, Dana White vanished for hours. And when he finally emerged, he dropped a bomb. The entire card had been reshuffled. New opponents, new matchups, everything changed overnight. Nate Diaz would fight Tony Ferguson in the main event. Two legends past their prime in a fight that actually made sense. Chimaev would fight Kevin Holland instead. Musical chairs with professional fighters less than 24 hours before the event. Here's why fans immediately smelled a setup. The original Diaz vs Chimaev matchup was hated. Hardcore fans saw it as the UFC feeding a beloved veteran to a young killer just to humiliate him on his way out. Diaz himself had made it clear he wasn't happy about the fight. He wanted out of his UFC contract, and this felt like punishment for wanting to leave. The pay-per-view wasn't selling well. Nobody wanted to watch Nate get destroyed. But Diaz vs Ferguson, that was a dream fight. Two fan favorites. Two action fighters from the same era with history and mutual respect. It was the fight people actually wanted to see. So what if they planned it? What if Chimaev was told to miss weight, knowing it would force the card to be reshuffled into something fans would actually buy? Showtime kick was scripted. Anthony Pettis versus Benson Henderson for the lightweight championship. Final round. And then it happened. Pettis ran up the cage wall and kicked Henderson in the face. The Showtime kick. One of the most iconic moments in combat sports history. A move so spectacular, so perfectly executed, so impossibly cinematic that it defined an entire era. It's on every highlight reel, poster, every discussion about the greatest moments in MMA. But watch the fight closely. Right before Pettis launches himself off the cage, Benson Henderson does something strange. He taps his foot against the fence. Not accidentally, deliberately. One clear tap with his right foot against the bottom of the cage. And seconds later, Pettis runs up that exact spot and throws the kick that made him famous. The conspiracy theory is simple. It was planned. The foot tap was the signal. And the most legendary knockout in MMA history was actually choreographed. Jose Aldo lied about his age. Jose Aldo, the king of Rio, the greatest featherweight in MMA history, 9 title defenses, nearly a decade of dominance, retired in 2025 at age 38, or did he? According to his birth certificate, Aldo was born September 9th, 1986. But here's the problem. In 1980s Brazil, especially in the favelas where Aldo grew up, birth registrations were a disaster. In the 1990s, 40% of births in Brazil went unregistered. In the 1980s, it was worse. In impoverished areas like the favelas, almost nobody registered births immediately. Parents waited months, sometimes years, sometimes never did it at all. So when Aldo finally got to the US, he had to tell the government office how old he was. And it's more than likely he told a small lie. If you're getting documents because you wanted to be a professional fighter, why wouldn't you shave a few years off? Think about it. You're a talented fighter trying to break into the big league. Youth is valued. Promoters want young prospect, not aging veteran. Being 23 looks way better than being 26 or 27. And here's the rumor that won't die. One of Aldo's closest friends allegedly said behind closed doors that Aldo is over 40 years old. Not 36, over 40. The source is weak, trust me bro level. But the rumor has circulated for years in MMA circles. People who claim to know Aldo personally say he's older than his records show. Jones elbow. At the Ultimate Fighter 10 finale, Jon Jones faced Matt Hamill. Early in the opening round, Jones secured top position and began raining downward 12-6 elbows. Strikes that dropped the point of the elbow straight down from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Under the unified rules in effect at the time, 12-6 elbows to any part of the head were explicitly illegal. Referee Steve Mazzagatti first warned Jones after the initial elbow landed, but when Jones delivered a second illegal elbow moments later, the bout was halted and Jones was disqualified. As a result, Hamill was awarded the victory by disqualification, marking the only loss on Jones' professional record for many years. The disqualification stirred immediate controversy. Jones appeared to be on the verge of a dominant win. He'd visibly hurt Hamill and controlled both position and pace. But the strict interpretation of the downward elbow rule left no debate. Any landing of a 12-6 elbow on a grounded opponent mandated disqualification. On November 1st, 2024, the Association of Boxing Commissions in Combative Sports lifted the ban on 12-6 elbows, and UFC President Dana White has publicly supported overturning Jones' lone defeat, arguing the rule was inconsistently enforced. Petr Yan knee. At UFC 259, bantamweight champion Petr Yan and challenger Aljamain Sterling were in a fight when at 4 minutes and 29 seconds of round 4, Sterling went to the ground and placed his knee on the canvas, rendering him a grounded opponent. In Russian, Yan yelled to his corner, "Can I knee him?" and his corner mistakenly replied yes. So Jan secured Sterling's arms and delivered a knee directly to Sterling's head, an explicit violation of the unified rules against knee strikes to a grounded fighter. The ringside physician immediately ruled Sterling unable to continue, and though the reason Jan kneed Sterling seemed to be a miscommunication, referee Mark Smith deemed the foul intentional, awarding Sterling the victory by disqualification. With 2 judges having Jan ahead on the scorecards and 1 judge scoring it for Sterling at the time of the foul, Sterling was crowned the new UFC Bantamweight champion, the first in UFC history to win a title by disqualification. The outcome sparked widespread debate about the severity and enforcement of the rule, especially considering almost everybody thought that Petr Yan was clearly winning, leading until that moment. Fans called it a robbery and criticized Sterling for taking the win, causing a rematch being scheduled later that year, where Sterling won by split decision. Biting. At UFC Vegas 89, Igor Severino was disqualified in the second round for biting his opponent, Andre Lima. As the two were clinched against the cage, Severino sank his teeth into Lima's left bicep, drawing an immediate cry of pain. Lima pointed to the bite mark. Referee Chris Tagnoni paused the action, consulted the replay, and ruled the foul intentional, ending the bout at 2 minutes and 52 seconds of round 2 and awarding Lima the victory by disqualification. This was the first, and so far only, biting disqualification in the UFC's history. UFC President Dana White subsequently gave Lima a bite of the night bonus and severed ties with Severino. A legal head kick. During the prelims of UFC 217 in New York, heavyweight Walt Harris faced Mark Godbeer. Early in round 1, Harris struck Godbeer in the groin and immediately threw a head kick, landing flush on Godbeer's temple before Godbeer had fully recovered or assumed a legal fighting position. Because a kick to the head of a downed or recovering opponent is expressly forbidden, the UFC ruled the blow as an intentional foul and disqualified Harris on the spot, awarding Godbeer the victory by disqualification at 4 minutes and 29 seconds of round 1. After the bell. At UFC 222, CB Dalloway and Hector Lombard were battling through the opening round of their middleweight bout when the horn sounded to signal the end of round 1. Lombard landed 2 massive punches, flush to Dalloway's head, after the horn had already sounded. Dalloway crumpled to the canvas and was unable to continue due to the illegal blows. The referee immediately talked with the commission officials, ruled the strikes as intentional fouls, and disqualified Lombard on the spot, awarding CB Dalloway the victory by disqualification. This marked the UFC's first disqualification of 2018, and honestly, one of the most blatant after the bell strikes ever thrown in the UFC. Debut disqualification. At UFC Fight Night Cejudo vs Dillashaw, former Carolina Panthers defensive end Greg Hardy made his UFC debut against Alan Crowder. Late in the second round, Crowder was on one knee, a fully grounded position, when Hardy drove a hard knee into Crowder's head. Referee Dan Miragliotta jumped at Hardy, throwing him off Crowder and stopped the action, ruled the strike intentional, and disqualified Hardy at 2 minutes and 28 of round 2, awarding Crowder the victory by disqualification. Late disqualification. At UFC 142, Eric Silva appeared to finish Carlo Prater in just 29 seconds into their welterweight bout. After Prater was dropped by a knee, Silva unloaded hammer fists and punches. Referee Mario Yamasaki stopped the fight. Silva ran along the octagon and celebrated what he thought was a win. And the commentators as well thought that Silva had won. But moments later, Yamasaki came back into the octagon and ruled the sequence an intentional foul. The foul is being blows to the back of the head. Because Prater could not continue, Silva was disqualified and Prater was awarded the victory by disqualification. The sudden turn of events left the commentators, fighters, and even fans in shock at what happened. Pereira knee. At UFC Fight Night 167, veteran Diego Sanchez and rising contender Michel Pereira met in what was one of the weirdest UFC fights of all time. Sanchez opened the fight with a cartwheel somersault kick of some sort. Pereira responded with a running off the cage kick. And halfway through round 3, Pereira does a backflip on Diego Sanchez that would later become one of the most viral highlights of his career. But near the end of round 3, Pereira landed a knee to Sanchez's body, dropping Sanchez to one knee against the cage. Then Pereira drove a knee straight into Sanchez's head. Under the unified rules, any knee to the head of a grounded opponent's immediate foul. Referee Jason Herzog stopped the action at 3 minutes and 9 seconds of the round, ruled the strike intentional, and, with Sanchez unable to continue, disqualified Pereira on the spot. The official result was a DQ win for Sanchez.
Zabit Magomed Sharipov. Zabit arrived in the UFC in September 2017 as a
12-1 champion from Absolute Championship Berkut. His blend of unorthodox striking and seamless grappling earned him 6 straight wins in the octagon and launched him to number 3 in the featherweight rankings. Expectations were at an all-time high, and a title shot seemed inevitable, but behind the scenes, Zabit's body was already paying the price. Recurring ankle injuries forced him to withdraw from 3 scheduled bouts in late 2018 and mid-2019. Each cancellation meant a lost opportunity to prove himself against top contenders and maintain momentum. But in early 2020, what began as routine treatments revealed a more serious problem, an autoimmune disorder that compromised his recovery and immune system. Surgery was unavoidable, and rehabilitation stretched into months. By the time he was cleared to train again, the division moved on without him. With no fight scheduled over 18 months, the UFC removes Zabit from the official rankings on April 26, 2021. Fighters he once outpaced like Yair Rodriguez got title shots in headline pay-per-views. In June 2022, Zabit confirmed his retirement. He left the sport undefeated in the UFC competition, but without ever fighting for the belt. His story is not one of failure, but a reminder that even insane talent can be sidelined by things beyond technique and skill. Today, Zabit is pursuing a career in medicine and also helps coach his younger brother and nephew in martial arts. Sage Northcutt. Sage Northcutt exploded onto the UFC scene at just 19 years old, making his debut on October 3rd, 2015 at UFC 192 against Francisco Trevino. Competing at a 160-pound catchweight, Northcutt delivered a whirlwind performance, TKOing Trevino in just 57 seconds, instantly branding himself as MMA's hottest teenage prospect. 2 months later, he continued the hype train by choking out Cody Pfister in round 2, this time dropping to lightweight and earning his second UFC win. But Northcutt took a gamble on size and accepted a welterweight debut against Brian Barberena on January 30th, 2016, not even 2 months later. Barberena, a seasoned fighter, exposed Northcutt's inexperience, locking in an arm triangle late in round 2 and handing the teenager his first professional defeat. Seeking redemption, Sage turned to lightweight on July 9th, 2016, defeating Enrique Marin by unanimous decision and proving he belonged among the UFC's rising 155-pound contenders. Confidence high, Northcutt again ventured up to welterweight against Mickey Gall on December 17th, 2016, but history repeated itself. Gall secured a second-round rear naked choke, exposing persistent wrestling and defensive gaps in Northcutt's game. 2 losses in 4 months stalled his momentum and shattered the aura of invincibility that had propelled his early career. Over the next 2 years, Sage strung together 3 more UFC wins. Yet despite a respectable 6-2 UFC record, the UFC opted not to renew his contract in November 2018. Dana White bluntly explained, "Sage is young, and Sage needs some work. Let him get work in other organizations. Maybe we'll pick him back up in a couple of years." Northcutt signed with one championship and aimed to rebuild his stock, but his one debut on May 17th, 2019 ended in a 29-second knockout loss to Cosmo Alexandre, resulting in 8 facial fractures and another lengthy layoff. As of mid-2025, Sage carries a 12-3 pro record, but has never again ignited the mainstream buzz he once had. Muhammad Mokaev. Muhammad Mokaev entered the UFC in March 2021 as an unbeaten rising star, quickly making a name for himself with high-level wrestling and submission skills. Over his first 7 UFC bouts, he went 7-0, capping that run at UFC 304 by defeating Manel Kape in a flyweight title eliminator bout. At just 23 years old and holding an undefeated UFC record with 4 submission wins, Mokaev seemed like the next contender to challenge Alessandro Pantoja for the belt. Yet immediately after that victory, his UFC contract expired, and the promotion opted not to renew it. That the decision wasn't simply about Mokaev's fighting style, but reflected broader matchmaking priorities. Essentially, UFC matchmakers were not fans of certain aspects of his game and his behavior towards them, and so they chose to invest in other names moving forward. Despite having earned a title shot on merit, Mokaev found himself publicly released from the roster. Since leaving the UFC, Mokaev has remained active across other organizations and is reportedly in talks with the PFL for future fights. Bo Nickel. Bo Nickel arrived in the UFC in March 2023 as one of the most celebrated collegiate wrestlers ever, having 3 NCAA Division I titles and a flawless pro debut on Dana White's Contender Series. He made his octagon debut at UFC 285, submitting Jamie Pickett in round 1, then followed with a first-round finish of Val Woodburn and a second-round finish at Cody Brundage, all while being an absurd favorite. But after his fight against Paul Craig, where Bo Nickel put on a lackluster decision win while not using any of his wrestling, fans started to question how Bo would fare against top-level fighters, or even ranked fighters for that matter. But on May 3rd, 2025, Bo Nickel stepped into the co-main event against former ONE Championship double champion Rainer de Ritter, an opponent he personally requested, believing his wrestling would dominate. The matchup was billed as a passing of the torch moment, hype train versus seasoned finisher, but the fight went differently differently than many expected. DeRitter controlled range throughout round 1, then in round 2 landed a perfectly timed knee to Bo Nickal's body, sending Bo Nickal to the ground. The knee forced a TKO at 1:17 of round 2, marking the first loss of Bo Nickal's MMA career and abruptly halting his momentum. Fans were surprised at how easily DeRitter made Bo Nickal look, and went to social media saying he got fraud checked and humbled in the aftermath. Nickal announced plans to return to competitive wrestling, signing with Hulk Hogan's Real American Freestyle promotion, while his UFC comeback timeline has grown uncertain, splitting focus between MMA and high-level wrestling. It's left him navigating a career pivot rather than charging toward a championship gold. Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker joined the UFC in late 2018 and made his octagon debut, viciously knocking out Khalil Roundtree Jr. in the first round. He followed that up with a 15-second spinning back fist TKO of Justin Leddit and a flying knee stoppage of Misha Serkinov at UFC 235. 3 bonus-earning finishes that rocketed him to number 5 in the light heavyweight standings by spring 2019. Some people were even saying that Johnny Walker would be the man to take down Jon Jones, but as quickly as he rose, Walker's trajectory stalled at UFC 244. Veteran Corey Anderson exposed gaps in Walker's defensive striking, ending him by first-round TKO. A unanimous decision loss to Nikita Krylov in March 2020 further underlined weaknesses in his pacing and fight IQ, though he rallied with a knockout of Ryan Spann and managed wins over Ion Kudalaba, Paul Craig, and Anthony Smith between 2020 and 2023. Walker could never reassemble the unstoppable momentum of his 2019 run. Knockout defeats to Thiago Santos, Jamal Hill, Magomed Ankalaev, and Volkan Ozdemir kept him on the wrong side of title contention. Darren Till. Darren Till came into the UFC in May 2015 as a 12-0 prospect, stepping in to face Wendell Oliveira at UFC Fight Night 67. He dominated from the start, securing a second-round TKO via elbows, and immediately earning the Performance of the Night bonus, an insane debut that hinted at stardom. His next outing against Nicholas Dalby at UFC Fight Night 76 ended in a majority draw, but Till rebounded with decisive wins over Jason Ayari and Bojan Belakovic, building his record to 15-0-1 before the hype train truly left the station. But his big moment came on October 21st, 2017. Till faced veteran contender Donald Cerrone in the main event and stunned the MMA world by dismantling him in just 4 minutes and 20 seconds. A crisp 2-punch combination buckled Cerrone that ended the fight. Till's third straight performance of the night and proof that he belonged among the division's elite. With momentum at full throttle, Till earned a welterweight title shot against Tyron Woodley at UFC 228. But in Dallas, Woodley exposed Till's defensive gaps, dropping him with a big right before sliding into a second-round Darce choke that forced the first loss of Till's MMA career. The defeat left him needing to rebuild rather than charge straight for the belt. On March 16, 2019, Till faced Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal landed a combination that crumpled Till's chin and led to a second-round knockout, halting Till's comeback and highlighted persistent holes in his striking defense. Undeterred, Till moved up to middleweight and debuted against Kelvin Gastelum in a 3-round bout. Till eked out a split decision win, but the lackluster nature of the bout suggested he didn't improve much from his previous loss. His middleweight momentum never materialized. On December 10th, 2022, Till faced surging contender Dricus du Plessis and was submitted by rear naked choke in the 3rd round, marking his second finish loss in 4 fights and reinforcing that his early promise had long since faded. Darren Till's career arc shows that talent and hype can only carry a fighter so far. Unaddressed defensive liabilities, poor timed weight class jumps, and multiple setbacks transformed one of UFC's brightest prospects into a cautionary tale. In this sport, raw power and charisma must be matched by technical skill and strategy to truly fulfill promise. Jones vs. Reyes. Jon Jones had defended his light heavyweight title multiple times and was considered one of the greatest UFC fighters in history. Going into UFC 247, most expected him to handle Dominic Reyes without too much trouble. That's not what happened. From the start, Reyes came out aggressive. He was pressuring Jones, landing clean combinations, and doing something nobody had really done before, making Jones look uncomfortable. The body kicks were landing, his boxing was sharp, and for the first 3 rounds, Reyes was controlling the fight. At one point in the 2nd round, Jones actually turned and moved away from Reyes' pressure, which was unusual to see from someone of his caliber. By round 3, Reyes was winning the striking battle. The stats would later show that he landed 116 significant strikes compared to Jones's 104. The first time in Jones' 22-fight career he'd been outstruck. Reyes looked like he was on his way to pulling off the upset, but championship fights are 5 rounds for a reason. Rounds 4 and 5 saw a shift. Jones started mixing in his wrestling, secured a couple of takedowns, and turned up the pressure. Reyes was visibly tired, and Jones was doing what champions do, finding ways to win late in fights. When the final bell rang, both fighters thought they'd won. The crowd was buzzing, Then came the decision. Unanimous decision for Jon Jones. 48-47, 48-47, and 49-46. That last scorecard stood out immediately. Judge Joe Salas scored it 49-46, giving Jones 4 rounds in a fight where most people thought Reyes clearly won the first 3. The boos from the Houston crowd were immediate and loud. Here's where it gets interesting. Dana White, the UFC president, said at the post-fight press conference that he scored it 3 rounds to 2 in Reyes' favor. When your own boss disagrees with the judge's decision to crown your biggest star, that tells you something. The media agreed. 14 out of the 21 media members scoring at ringside had Reyes winning. Commentators were openly critical. Joe Rogan called the 49-46 scorecard insane. Dominic Cruz said the judge Joe Salas should have his judging card revoked. Reyes was understandably frustrated after the fight. He believed he'd done enough to win and made Jones look beatable for the first time in years. The problem was, he never got a chance to run it back. Jones moved on, eventually vacated the title to move to heavyweight, and Reyes went on a tough 3-fight losing streak by knockout. His career trajectory changed completely after that night. O'Malley vs. Jan. Going into this fight, O'Malley was a massive underdog. At one point, the betting lines had Jan as nearly a 3-1 favorite. On paper, it made sense. Jan was a former bantamweight champion, ranked number 1 in the division, and coming off tough losses that he was looking to bounce back from. O'Malley? He wasn't even ranked top 10. Dana White had made it clear before the fight. The winner would get the next title shot. That made the stakes even higher. From the opening bell, Jan pressed forward. He was attacking O'Malley's legs, backing him up, and looking like the favorite everyone expected. Most people watching thought Jan took the first round. He secured a takedown near the end and looked in control. The second round got violent. O'Malley came out and rocked Jan twice with sharp left hands. For a moment, it looked like he might finish the fight, but Jan responded with a massive overhand that stunned O'Malley right back. From there, Jan went to his wrestling, landing multiple takedowns and spending significant time on top. By the end of round 2, most observers felt Jan was up 2 rounds to none. Then came the third round. O'Malley landed a knee that cut Jan badly above his right eye. The momentum shifted. O'Malley was landing strikes. Jan was bleeding, but the former champion kept pushing forward. He continued shooting takedowns in the final minutes, trying to secure the round with grappling control. The fight went the distance. When the decision was announced, it was a split decision for Sean O'Malley. 2 judges scored at 29-28 for O'Malley. 1 judge had it 29-28 for Jan. The MMA community erupted. Petr Yan tweeted immediately after the fight, "F the judges." Fellow fighters piled on. Henry Cejudo called it the worst robbery in UFC history. Even O'Malley seemed unsure after the fight. When asked if he thought he won, he said he wanted to watch the fight back before deciding. He admitted that he didn't even know if he won and thought that it could have gone either way. And Khabib thought Jan won all 3 rounds. GSP vs. Hendricks. UFC 167 was supposed to be a celebration, the company's 20th anniversary, George St. Pierre breaking records. Instead, it turned into one of the most controversial decisions in UFC history. GSP came into this fight on an 11-fight win streak. He was the heavy favorite at -260. Johnny Hendricks, a 2-time NCAA wrestling champion with knockout power, was the underdog at +200. On paper, it was supposed to be another successful title defense for the Canadian legend. The fight started, and it became clear early that Hendricks wasn't intimidated. GSP secured a quick takedown in the first round and attempted a guillotine choke, but Hendricks fought it off. Then Hendricks started landing hard punches, elbows against the cage, a left knee. The round was competitive, but Hendricks looked comfortable and was marking up the champion's face. Round 2 is where things got serious. Hendricks came out smiling and immediately went to work. He cracked GSP with a massive left hand that made spit fly out of the champion's mouth. Then another uppercut. GSP was wobbled twice in the round, stumbling and trying to survive. Hendricks landed 37 total strikes to GSP's 30, with 19 being power shots compared to just the 7 from the champion. GSP's face was cut and swelling, and it was a clear 10-9 for Hendricks. The third round saw GSP settle down. He found the range with his jab, landed kicks, and controlled the pace better. It wasn't dominant, but he did enough to take the round. Round 4 swung back to Hendricks. He landed 41 total strikes to GSP's 24. The 5th and final round went to GSP. He landed 2 takedowns and found success in the clinch. Hendricks was still dangerous, but GSP's late fight championship experience showed. He controlled the octagon and finished strong. When the fight ended, both men raised their hands. The crowd waited. Then came the announcement. Split decision for Georges St. Pierre, 48-47, 48-47, 48-47. The boos were immediate and deafening. Here's what happened. All three judges scored 2 rounds to 5 identically. Everyone gave Hendricks round 2 and 4. Everyone gave GSP rounds 3 and 5. The entire fight came down to round 1. D'Amato and Weeks gave the first round to GSP. Trowbridge gave it to Hendricks. That was the difference between GSP keeping his title and Hendricks becoming champion. The problem? Almost nobody outside those 2 judges thought GSP won the first round. Then there was the visual test. Look at the fighters. GSP's face was battered, bruised, cut, and swollen. Dana White was livid. At the post-fight press conference, he said that he was blown away that GSP won. He went further, saying GSP knew he lost. His corner knew that he lost. Hendricks knew he won, and his corner knew they won. White even called for an immediate rematch and criticized the Nevada State Athletic Commission for its judging problems. Pimblett vs. Gordon. Paddy Pimblett was on a rocket ship to stardom. 3 fights in the UFC, 3 finishes, and a fan base that rivaled some champions. He was becoming one of the biggest draws in the sport without ever even fighting a ranked opponent. UFC 282 was supposed to be another showcase, another highlight reel finish, another step towards eventual title contention. Instead, it became one of the most controversial decisions in recent UFC history. From the opening moments of round 1, Gordon went to work. He cracked Pimblett with hard left hooks repeatedly. Pimblett's defensive weakness, something commentators had pointed out in previous fights, were on full display. Gordon was landing clean, landing often, and making Pimblett look uncomfortable. Pimblett had some moments with leg kicks and late flurry, but Gordon controlled most of the action. In the final seconds, Pimblett attempted a takedown, but Gordon reversed it and landed on top, drilling him with an elbow as the round ended. Most observers gave the first round to Gordon. Round 2 was more competitive. Both fighters had their moments. Pimblett landed some solid kicks and briefly threatened with a submission attempt. Gordon continued finding success with his left hand and landed hard shots throughout. At the end of the round, both fighters exchanged heavy punches. The stats were close. Paddy Pimblett landed 28 significant strikes to Gordon's 24, and 47 total strikes to Gordon's 39. Gordon controlled over 2 minutes of the round on the ground after securing a takedown. It was a toss-up round, but Pimblett seemed to edge it slightly. The third round is where things got messy. Gordon shot for a takedown early and spent the majority of the round pressing Pimblett against the cage. He controlled nearly 4 minutes of the round, grinding away at the Liverpool fighter. Pimblett landed a few elbows and knees with his back against the fence, but the strike output was minimal from both fighters. Pimblett landed just 6 significant strikes in the entire round, while Gordon landed only 4. It was ugly, but Gordon was dictating the action and controlling the position. When the final bell rang, most people watching thought Gordon had done enough. He seemed to win round 1 clearly. Round 3 was his with all the control time, and round 2 was close enough that either fighter could get it. Then came the decision. Unanimous decision for Paddy Pimblett. 29-28 on all 3 scorecards. The boos from the Las Vegas crowd were immediate. Social media erupted. Fighters, media members, and fans all called it a robbery. At the post-fight press conference, UFC President Dana White didn't completely dismiss the decision, but made an interesting comment about Gordon's game plan. White said Gordon had a horrible game plan in the 3rd round, and questioned why he didn't try to finish the fight instead of holding Pimblett up against the cage. White suggested that Gordon threw the round away by assuming he'd already won the first 2. Pimblett defended the decision afterward, telling Joe Rogan he won the first 2 rounds pretty easily, and that there was no controversy. But Joe Rogan strongly disagreed with the decision, even arguing with some who thought Paddy Pimblett won. Wrestled a bear. Before Khabib became the undefeated UFC lightweight champion, he was wrestling bears. And no, I'm not being metaphorical here. Picture this. It's the late 1990s in the mountains of Dagestan, Russia. Khabib is just 9 years old, and his father, Abdul Manap, has an unconventional training method in mind. Now, you might be thinking, what kind of training could a 9-year-old possibly do? Running, push-ups, shadow boxing. Wrong. Try wrestling an actual bear cub. There's video footage of this, and it's absolutely wild. Young Khabib, barely bigger than the bear itself, is grappling with this animal in what looks like someone's backyard. The bear is chained, but that doesn't make it any less insane. We're talking about a wild animal with claws and teeth going up against a small child. Now here's where it gets interesting. Khabib's father wasn't doing this just for shock value or to create some viral moment. Abdulmanap was a decorated athlete and combat sports coach who believed in pushing boundaries. He wanted to instill fearlessness in his son from an early age. And what better way to teach a kid to be fearless than to have him wrestle a creature that could literally maul him? The video shows Khabib actually taking the bear down at one point, using techniques that would later become his signature moves in the octagon. Talk about unconventional training methods. While other kids his age were playing video games or soccer, Khabib was learning to grapple with one of nature's most powerful animals. But here's the kicker. This wasn't a one-time stunt. This was part of Khabib's actual childhood training regimen. Years later, when asked about it, Khabib would joke that the bear was one of his toughest opponents. Kicked off a plane. Picture this. It's January 11th, 2025. Khabib is boarding a Frontier Airlines flight. He's retired now, hasn't fought since 2020, but he's heading to California to support his teammates ahead of UFC 311. Everything seems normal. He's got his exit row seat, probably looking forward to some extra legroom. And then, things go completely sideways. Flight attendant approaches Khabib during the customary exit row briefing and asks him multiple times if he's willing and able to assist in the event of an emergency. Standard procedure, right? Except this is where things get heated. In the video that went viral, the staff member tells Khabib, "We're either going to have you switch your seat because my flight attendants are not allowing you to sit in the exit row, or you're going to have to get off this plane because they're not comfortable with you sitting in the exit row." Here's where it gets controversial. The video shows Khabib responding, clearly frustrated. He says, "It's not fair. When I was making check-in, they asked me, 'Do I know English?' I said yes. Then why you guys do this?" He even tells them he knows the language, he knows English, and he knows how to help people. But here's the kicker. The airline claims Khabib didn't respond to their initial questions despite repeated attempts, which placed him in non-compliance with FAA requirements. Khabib's version, he says the lady who came to him was very rude from the beginning, and even though he speaks decent English and agreed to assist, she still insisted on removing him from his seat. So what happened next? After about 2 minutes of conversation, the attendant called security and Khabib was deplaned from the aircraft. The incident sparked massive debate online. Many people accused the airline of racial or religious profiling. Critics on social media pointed to what they saw as discrimination against the Russian Muslim fighter. The airline maintained it was purely about safety compliance and had nothing to do with ethnicity. Fought with a broken foot. It's UFC 254, Fight Island, Khabib versus Justin Gaethje. Here's the thing. This was Khabib's first fight since his father and head coach, Abdulmanap, died in July from complications of COVID. 3 weeks before the fight, Khabib broke his foot. We're not talking about a minor injury here. According to Dana White, Khabib had 2 broken toes and a bone in his foot that was broken. The UFC president even said the fight could have been in jeopardy because of it. Now here's where things get absolutely wild. Khabib never told anyone. He was just walking around as normal. And if that wasn't enough, Khabib's coach Javier Mendez revealed that Khabib also had the mumps 2 weeks before he started his training camp. Talk about everything going wrong at once. Your father just passed away, you've got the mumps, you broke your foot, and you're supposed to fight one of the most dangerous strikers in the UFC. So what happened in the fight? Khabib submitted Gaethje via triangle choke at 1 minute, 34 seconds of the second round. Degree in economics. Now this next fact might surprise you. When you think of Khabib, you probably picture a fierce grappler smashing people in the octagon, right? Well, there's a lot more to the eagle than just fighting. While most UFC fighters are spending every waking hour training, eating, and recovering, Khabib is sitting in a classroom taking economics courses. That's right, Khabib graduated from the Makachkala Finance and Economics College with a secondary vocational education. But he didn't stop there. Khabib earned a graduate degree in finance from the Plekhanov Russian University of Economics. Now, you might be thinking, when did he have time for this? Well, here's the thing. He was enrolled as a 4th-year student at Plekhanov Russian University of Economics while he was still actively fighting in the UFC. Used to be a fan of McGregor. If you follow UFC, you know that Khabib and Conor McGregor have one of the most bitter rivalries in MMA history. But here's something that will blow your mind. They used to be friendly. Ahead of McGregor's fight at UFC 178, friendly Twitter exchange took place between McGregor and Khabib. At this time, McGregor was still fighting at featherweight and was a rising star. Khabib was an undefeated lightweight prospect, making waves in the division. Here's where it gets interesting. It started when Khabib complimented one of Conor's walkout tees, claiming that he needed to buy it. Now, you might think that's just casual politeness, right? But wait, there's more. Khabib tweeted, "Hey Conor, I'm in Vegas when you come let me know." He actually wanted to meet up with with McGregor in person. And what did Conor say? McGregor responded, "Let's do it, brother. I fly out to Vegas tomorrow. Hit me up and we can train." Khabib and McGregor actually met up and took a picture together. Khabib even posted it on Twitter with the caption, "With Conor McGregor after his unbelievable victory in UFC 178. He called McGregor's performance unbelievable." According to one version of events, the friendship ended when journalists asked Conor how his friend Khabib was doing. The Irishman replied, "My friend Khabib, there are no friends in this business." They say Khabib noted these words. Bouncer at a nightclub. Now this next story shows just how close Khabib came to never becoming the UFC legend we know today. Before the undefeated record, before the millions of dollars, before the fame, Khabib was on the verge of giving it all up. It's around 2014 and 2015. Khabib is dealing with what every fighter dreads most, back-to-back devastating injuries. In 2014, he suffered torn cruciate ligaments in his knee, and a year later, in the run-up to a scheduled fight with Tony Ferguson, he broke a rib. We're talking about serious career-threatening injuries here, the kind that make you question everything. Now, here's where things get desperate. Back-to-back injuries had forced Khabib to take a 2-year break from fighting. That's an eternity in MMA. Fighters lose momentum, fans forget about you, and younger guys start taking your spot. But the bigger problem? Money. Here's what most people don't realize. Khabib was already considering a bouncer job to earn money. That's right, the future UFC lightweight champion was seriously thinking about standing outside nightclubs, checking IDs, and breaking up drunk fights. Think about that for a second. Khabib as a bouncer. Can you imagine walking up to a club and seeing the eagle at the door? Talk about the most overqualified security guard in history. Khabib's manager's a terrorist. It's October 4th, 2018, the UFC 229 press conference. Conor McGregor and Khabib are sitting across from each other, and the tension is already through the roof. But then McGregor turns his attention to someone else in the room. Khabib's manager, Ali Abdelaziz. Here's where things get absolutely explosive. McGregor said he was pulled off of a flight going from Cairo, Egypt to New York City on September 11th, 2001. He was caught with 5 passports in his possession. He turned informant and turned on the people that he was working with. I don't even know how that man is in this country. Now here's where the story gets even crazier. After being imprisoned on charges of document forgery in 2002, Abdelaziz was recruited by NYPD Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence David Cohen to work undercover collecting intelligence on Muslims of America, also known as Jamaat al-Fuqra, a group allegedly connected with terrorist organizations. That's right, Khabib's manager became a spy. He was issued a green card, became one of the NYPD's highest paid informants, and even cooperated with the FBI. But here's the twist. The FBI eventually began to suspect he was operating as a double agent, particularly after he was reportedly administered a polygraph examination. The FBI ended its relationship with Abdelaziz, and the American government unsuccessfully attempted to deport him. Think about that for a second. The FBI thought their own informant might be playing both sides, tried to deport him, and failed. And now this same guy is managing one of the biggest stars in UFC history. Slapped Artem Lobov. Now this next story is what set off the most infamous incident in UFC history, and it all started with a slap. UFC 223 is just days away. Khabib is preparing for his title fight against Max Holloway. Everything should be focused on the upcoming bout. But then, something happens that changes everything. Here's the backstory. Artem Lobov had given an interview with Russian media where he was highly critical of Khabib, claiming McGregor, and not Khabib, is the real champion. And what exactly did Lobov say? Khabib pulled out 6 times already. He always pulls out of fights. If something hurts a little bit, his ass or whatever, he pulls out. He can't even make weight. He doesn't give a shit about his fans. Conor shows up every time, no matter what. He's a true fighter. He's a true champion. Champion isn't just belt around your waist. It's mentality. It's your heart. Conor's a real champion, and Khabib is not even close. Now, if you know anything about Khabib, you know he doesn't let disrespect slide. So what happened when Khabib and Lobov crossed paths at a hotel in Brooklyn? Khabib and his entourage confronted Lobov. The two exchanged words in Russian, with Khabib demanding Lobov keep his name out of his mouth before walking up to Artem and appearing to slap him across the face. Almost fought Jamal Hill. It's December 5th, 2024 at the UFC Performance Institute in Las Vegas. Alex Pereira is training, minding his own business, when Jamal Hill walks up to him. Hill approaches and says, "Not on Twitter now," referencing their ongoing social media beef. Here's where things get wild. Pereira gives Hill a friendly fist bump at first, but then the tone shifts completely. Pereira throws gloves down in front of Hill, signaling him to meet inside the cage to settle their differences right then and there. We're talking about an impromptu fight at the UFC UFC gym. No contracts, no pay-per-view, just two light heavyweights ready to throw down. Hill's response? What the fuck we need gloves for? We're not getting paid right now. He argued that if they were going to fight for free, they could just throw hands without gloves. But here's the kicker. According to Hill, Pereira's coach told him that Pereira said, "You're still sleeping," in Portuguese, a reference to the knockout Hill suffered at UFC 300. Eventually, Cruz separated the two light heavyweights before things got physical. The whole thing was caught on video and went viral instantly. Found out his girlfriend was married. Pereira dated a woman named Merle Christine for about 2 years before getting engaged in early 2023. Everything seemed perfect. He was at the top of his game in the UFC, had found love, and was planning a future with someone he trusted. But then, just a few months into their engagement, everything fell apart. Here's what happened. In an interview, Pereira confessed, "Well, it's a little hard to talk about this, because for me, I already deleted this person from my life. I would also like to ask my fans to also delete her from your life. It was a person I believed in. I put her in my house together with my family. After all, I found out that she was married." That's right, the UFC pound-for-pound star claimed that Merle was in fact already married and had been hiding it from him. Picture this. You're planning your wedding, you've brought this person into your home, introduced them to your family, and then you discover they've been married the entire time. Now, here's where things get messy. Merle released a statement defending herself, saying, "I was married in the past. Alex was too, but I got separated before I started a relationship with Alex. You guys are so stupid to think I could move to the States having a husband. LOL." She denied the accusations completely. The pair then went back and forth on social media airing their dirty laundry. The end result was the pair decided to split, and Pereira deleted all traces of her from his social media. Both Pereira and his ex-girlfriend used to share photos and videos of each other on Instagram, but have since unfollowed each other and removed all evidence that they were together. The whole situation became a public controversy that played out online for everyone to see. And if that wasn't enough drama, after Pereira lost his light heavyweight championship at UFC 313, Merle celebrated on social media, apparently still holding a grudge long after their split. Accused of rape. It's August 2024. Meredith Brown, a TikTok user with over 54,000 followers, posted a series of videos accusing Pereira of rape. In a 20-minute series of videos, Brown accused the fighter of premeditated rape during the UFC 302 fight weekend, which took place in June 2024. She claimed the assault occurred at a hotel after she and a friend were originally invited for a night out with the UFC champ and an unnamed assistant. Brown alleges that she and her friend, who are 21 and 20 years old respectively, were invited to hang out with Pereira and an associate of his. According to her account, what started as a meetup turned into something far more serious. She detailed her story across multiple videos that quickly went viral across social media platforms. But here's where things took a turn. An alleged screenshot showing a private Instagram exchange between Brown and someone else surfaced. In the screenshot, Brown seemingly pats herself on the back for the fame she has garnered over the past few days. The original post by Brown has been taken down, her Instagram account has been deactivated, and her friend and alleged witness to the crime seemingly unfollowed her on social media. Brown deleted the first video she shared on TikTok about the accusation. Furthermore, she deleted videos of herself at UFC 299, during which she allegedly tried to draw Sean O'Malley's attention. The deletion of said videos comes in response to her claim of having never attended a UFC event before UFC 302. Pereira, for his part, has not yet publicly addressed the allegation. No criminal charges were ever filed, and the situation eventually faded from headlines as Brown's credibility came under intense scrutiny. KO'd sparring partner. A video recently surfaced showing Pereira knocking out his sparring partner with a brutal left hand. In the video, Pereira dug the body several times before landing the final blow. It appears that Pereira was challenged to a hard spar by the man while training at Fusion XL in Florida. Pereira hit his opponent to the body multiple times early in the footage, and Pereira put the finishing touches on him, brutally knocking him out with a left hook to the chin. Here's where things got controversial. One major rule in combat is that all sparring footage remains private. It should never find its way onto the internet. But that's not what happened in this instance. The video went viral across social media platforms. The reaction was intense. Fans online were less than impressed with the reigning UFC light heavyweight champion, with many expressing disgust at the footage. But not everyone saw it that way. Some fans pushed back, pointing out the context and saying this wasn't one of his regular partners, that the guy kept calling Pereira out, and then they sparred. Others defended Pereira, noting he didn't post the video himself, and that willingly sparring with a UFC champion like Pereira is its own choice. Worked at a tire shop. Before the UFC stardom, before the championship belts, before the nickname Stonehands, Alex Pereira was just another kid trying to survive. He left middle school at the age of 12 and got a job in a tire shop. We're talking about repairing tires day after day. Backbreaking work that most people would never associate with a future 2-division UFC champion. Pereira has reflected in interviews, saying the work was hard, but it taught him discipline, hinting at how those early lessons carried over into his fighting life. Fast forward to today, and Pereira hasn't forgotten where he came from. After his brutal victory at UFC 320, Pereira returned to the tire shop saying, "Hello everyone, as promised. I said after the fight, I was gonna come back to the tire shop. This is a place that has a very beautiful story." In the video, he didn't hesitate to step in and get his hands dirty, swapping some tires off their rims with tools at hand. There's even a picture of Alex Pereira on Google Maps working at the tire shop in 2013. Alcoholic teenager. Pereira quit school at the age of 12 and got himself a job at a tire shop, where the crew ran on a steady flow of iced cachaças, a Brazilian rum. Pereira was soon drinking a liter of the beverage every day by the age of 16, along with a few bottles of beer as well. Think about that for a second. By 16 years old, Pereira was consuming nearly a liter of alcohol daily. Sometimes he would take payments in the form of prepaid drinks instead of money when he was working in the shop. He was literally getting paid in alcohol. Pereira realized that he was addicted when he wanted to stop but could not. Here's the turning point. In 2012, Pereira went to a bar and ordered 1 can of beer. He drank it. Cool. He ordered another one. His goal was to have 2 and go back home. He drank it and couldn't control himself. He walked out of the bar in bad shape. From that point on, he knew he couldn't control it, so he never put another drop of alcohol in his mouth. Pereira admitted that he still gets urges when he sees other people drinking, but he chooses to stay away since he believes he's incapable of stopping at 1 or 2 servings. His son taunted Israel Adesanya. It's March 2017. Pereira and Adesanya are fighting their second kickboxing match. The rematch started off competitive, but Adesanya started to hurt Pereira, even securing a standing 8 count. While Pereira looked like he was about to lose, he came back in the 3rd round and finished Adesanya with a left hook. This was the first knockout loss of Adesanya's combat sports career. After the fight, Alex Pereira's son got into the ring and mocked Adesanya by falling to the ground. The kid literally laid down next to the unconscious Adesanya, imitating how he'd been knocked out. Now here's where this story gets wild. Adesanya never forgot. Fast forward 6 years to UFC 287 in April 2023. He knocked out Pereira, and right after, Adesanya made a sleeping gesture at Pereira's kid to make sure he knew that he knocked his dad out. Alex Pereira, a former 2-division Glory kickboxing champion who brought one thing to the UFC: power. And while some will point to his low kicks, Pereira's real signature is the left hook. It's put some of the best strikers in the world to sleep. That left hook isn't just thrown with power, it's thrown with intention. Pereira uses his jab to measure distance and keep opponents guessing. He'll feint, shift his weight, make you think about the leg kick, a compact left hook that comes over the guard or catches you mid-movement. It doesn't travel far, but it doesn't need to. The most iconic example, Israel Adesanya at UFC 281. Pereira stalked him down, stayed patient, then landed a left hook that buckled Izzy and sealed the knockout. It was the same punch that had knocked out Adesanya in kickboxing years earlier. Different sport, same result. But don't sleep on the low kicks. Pereira's calf kicks are vicious and set up the left hook. You prepare to check the kick, and the hook comes upstairs. You stay high to defend the punch, and your leg gets chopped. It's a dilemma with no good answer. Jon Jones. Jon Jones wasn't just a champion, he was a problem solver, and his favorite solution? The spinning back elbow. Jones used his 84.5-inch reach to control distance, jabbing and picking you apart from range. Then he'd close the gap, tie you up against the cage, and the moment you felt safe in the clinch, he'd spin. No warning, no setup, just a sharp elbow crashing across your temple with fight-ending force. The most famous victim? Stephan Bonner at UFC 94. Jones spun, landed clean, and Bonner dropped instantly. But it wasn't a fluke. Jones kept this move locked and loaded throughout his career, and once opponents knew it existed, they had to respect it. That fear opened up everything else. Georges St-Pierre. Georges St-Pierre wasn't just a welterweight champion, he was a technician. And while GSP had a huge arsenal, one move always stole the show: the Superman punch. This wasn't some flashy gimmick thrown for highlight reels. GSP used it as a tactical weapon. He'd spend rounds establishing his jab and mixing in kicks. He made you think about everything. everything. Then out of nowhere, he'd leap forward, knee rising like he's throwing a kick, and bam, a straight right hand crashing through your guard while you're still trying to defend the kick that never came. Max Holloway. Max Holloway doesn't just fight, he makes statements. And his most iconic move isn't even a technique. It's a point to the ground, a universal signal for, let's stand right here and throw down. Holloway has done this multiple times, but the most legendary moment came at UFC 300 against Justin Gaethje. With 10 seconds left in the final round, Max pointed to the center of the octagon. Both fighters walked to the middle and unloaded everything they had left. Punch for punch, no defense, just pure will. The crowd exploded, the fight ended, and Max knocked Gaethje out cold with 1 second left on the clock. Khamzat Chimaev doesn't waste time. No feeling out process, no glove touch. The second the bell rings, he's already sprinting across the octagon for a takedown. It's not aggression, it's an ambush. Chimaev's instant takedown is his signature. He explodes forward the moment the fight starts, closing distance before opponents can even settle into their stance. Once he gets his hands on you, the takedown's coming, and the pressure that follows is relentless. The most memorable example, Li Jingliang. The bell rang, Khamzat Chimaev shot across the cage, secured a takedown immediately, then carried Li across the octagon before locking in the rear naked choke. It was dominance from the opening round, and Li never had a chance to fight his fight. Against DDP and Kevin Holland, the same story. Bell rings, Khamzat Chimaev shoots. He doesn't give you time to think or settle. The fight starts and you're already defending for your life. Nate Diaz doesn't just fight, he disrespects you while doing it. And nothing embodies that more than the Stockton slap. An open-handed smack across the face that's equal parts insult and assault. The Stockton slap isn't thrown for damage, it's thrown for humiliation. Diaz uses it mid-combination, slipping in slaps between punches to mock his opponent and break their mental game. It's a taunt that lands. And once he hits you with it, he's telling you and everyone watching that he's not worried. He's in control. One of the most iconic moments, Conor McGregor at UFC 196. Diaz landed a clean slap right across Conor's face, then followed it up with punches. Conor shot for a desperate takedown shortly after, and Diaz ended up winning the fight. That slap wasn't just disrespect, it was the turning point. Conor McGregor didn't just talk his way to the top. He backed it up with one weapon that made believers out of everyone, the left hand. A perfectly timed counterpunch that put many fighters to sleep. McGregor's left hand isn't just powerful, it's precise. He uses distance management, footwork, and timing to set it up. He'll lean back, let you reach, then step in and fire. It comes straight down the pipe, often catching opponents as they're lunging forward, doubling the impact. It's a counter-striker's dream, and Conor perfected it. Islam Makhachev is a grappling nightmare, a suffocating ground game built on control, pressure, and submissions you don't see coming. And his signature finish, the Darce choke, a sneaky technical submission that's caught some of the best fighters in the world off guard. The Darce isn't flashy, but it's effective. Makhachev sets it up during scrambles. He slips his arm around the neck, locks his hands, and squeezes. Once it's locked in, there's no escape. It's tight, it's fast, and the times he has used it, his opponents tap almost immediately. Charles Oliveira is the most dangerous fighter on the planet when the fight hits the ground. A submission specialist with more finishes than anyone in the UFC. And his signature, the rear naked choke. A classic, reliable, and absolutely lethal finish that's ended more fights than any flashy technique ever could. Oliveira doesn't just hunt for the back, he flows into it. Whether he's threatening with strikes, scrambling from bottom position, or transitioning off a failed takedown defense, he finds a way to take the back and lock in the choke. Once his hooks are in and his arms under the chin, it's over. The most iconic example, Justin Gaethje at UFC 274. Oliveira dropped Gaethje in the first round and locked in a rear naked choke for the finish. Gaethje, one of the toughest fighters in the world, had no choice but to tap. Against Dustin Poirier, it was the same story. Oliveira took the back in the third round and sunk in the rear naked choke to defend the lightweight title. Poirier fought it, but there was no escape. And in his most recent fight, another rear naked choke. The pattern's pretty clear. Ilia Topuria is a problem. A calculated finisher with power in both hands and the patience to wait for the perfect moment. And his signature? Hooks against the cage. The moment he traps you there, it's target practice, and you're the target. Topuria uses pressure and footwork to cut off the octagon, herding opponents towards the fence. Once your back touches the cage, he unloads. Left hook, right hook, both thrown with bad intentions. He doesn't just swing wildly, he picks his shots, finding openings in the guard and landing clean. The cage takes away your escape routes, and Topuria makes you pay for it. The most devastating example was Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 298. Topuria backed Volk to the cage and unleashed a perfect right hook that dropped him. He followed up with more shots on the ground for the knockout. The seemingly untouchable featherweight king was finished, and it started with pressure against the cage. Against Max Holloway, he used the same blueprint. Topuria cornered Max against the fence multiple times, landing heavy hooks throughout the fight. In the third round, he dropped Holloway with a right hook and finished him on the ground. Another former champion, another knockout, in the same location. Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier is one of the most dangerous lightweights to ever step in the octagon. Sharp boxing, devastating body shots, and an iron will. But there's one move he loves to attempt that almost never works: jumping the guillotine. Poirier sees an opening, his opponent shoots for a takedown or dips their head, and he leaps, wraps his arm around the neck midair, pulls guard, and squeezes. And it almost always gets defended. The problem? High-level fighters know it's coming. Poirier has tried it multiple times throughout his career, against guys like Khabib, Charles Oliveira, and others. Every time, they stay calm, they posture up, and escape. But Poirier keeps throwing it out there because when it works, it's a fight ender. Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland is the most frustrating fighter to watch, and the most frustrating fighter to face. His signature? The jab and front kick. Two basic, unglamorous weapons that he uses to control distance, pile up points, and put fans to sleep while winning decisions. Strickland doesn't come to brawl. He comes to poke, push, and frustrate. He throws a stiff jab to the face over and over, keeping opponents at the end of his reach. When they try to close distance, he snaps a front kick to the body, pushing them back. It's not exciting or explosive, but it works. The most shocking example, Israel Adesanya at UFC 293. Strickland jabbed and kicked his way to a decision victory over one of the most dynamic strikers in the sport. He didn't try to match Izzy's flashy striking. He just jabbed, kicked, and walked forward for 5 rounds. The crowd wasn't thrilled, but Strickland walked away with the middleweight title. Merab. Merab is a cardio machine with one goal: to break you with pressure. And his signature move isn't a knockout strike or a slick submission. It's literally picking you up and carrying you across the octagon like luggage. Merab's wrestling is relentless. He shoots takedowns over and over. He hoists his opponents off the ground and walks him across the cage. It humiliates you, and it shows everyone watching that you can't stop him. Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall is the fastest heavyweight you've ever seen. A 250-pound wrecking ball with the hand speed of a middleweight and the power to shut your lights off in seconds. And his signature? The 1-2 combination. Simple, clean, and devastatingly effective. Aspinall doesn't overcomplicate things. He closes distance, throws a sharp jab to the face, immediately follows with a straight hand, and the fight's over. It's textbook boxing, but at heavyweight speed that doesn't exist. The jab sets up the cross, and the cross puts people to sleep. Sean O'Malley. A flashy striker with precision that backs up all the talk. And his signature? The straight left hand. A sniper shot that drops opponents when they least expect it. O'Malley fights southpaw, using his constant movement, feints, and awkward angles to keep opponents guessing. He'll bounce, switch stances, throw kicks, then out of nowhere, fire the straight left down the pipe. It's fast, it's accurate, and it has knockout power. He doesn't load up, he just finds the opening and pulls the trigger. And his most defining moment? Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292. O'Malley landed a perfectly timed straight left in the second round that dropped Sterling and led to the TKO finish. He became the bantamweight champion with one clean shot, just like he'd been saying he would.
The Notorious. Conor McGregor's nickname, The Notorious, is a direct nod to his larger-than-life personality, and it's inspired by the Notorious B.I.G., the legendary rapper. McGregor has said that he admired the Notorious B.I.G., whose music and persona reflected confidence, flair, and defiance, traits Conor saw in himself. So the Notorious wasn't given to him by coaches or fans. He chose it himself and fully leaned into it, using it to craft one of the most iconic personas in combat sports history. Bones. John Jones' nickname Bones has been with him since high school, and it has nothing to do with him breaking bones or being a deadly striker. The nickname came from his coach during high school wrestling, who noticed John had an unusually thin and lanky frame, especially compared to other wrestlers in his weight class. So his coach started calling him Bones. Even as John filled out physically and became a dominant athlete, the name never left, and by the time he got into the UFC, John Bones Jones was already his full fighting identity, the Eagle. Khabib Nurmagomedov's nickname, the Eagle, is a powerful symbol of both his homeland and his philosophy as a fighter. Khabib hails from Dagestan, a republic in the North Caucasus region of Russia. The eagle is a national and cultural symbol of Dagestan. It represents strength, pride, freedom, and dominance over the mountains. Khabib has once said he chose the eagle to honor his roots and showcase where he came from on the world stage. Du Bronx. Charles Oliveira's nickname Du Bronx is one of the most unique and personal in the UFC, and it's not about fighting style or attitude, but where it came from. In Portuguese, Du Bronx translates to from the Bronx, but it doesn't refer to the Bronx in New York. It actually points to his favela in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which locals named the Bronx because of its poverty, brutality, crime, and rough conditions, much like the reputation of the actual Bronx decades ago. When Charles started training and competing, people would call him Charles from the Bronx, to reference where he grew up. Eventually, that shortened into Charles du Bronx, almost like a badge of honor. It's not just a nickname, it's a declaration of survival and pride in making it out of one of Brazil's toughest areas to become a UFC champion. El Matador. Born to Georgian parents in Germany and raised in Spain, he learned his nickname early in his MMA journey as a reference to Spanish bullfighting, highlighting his powerful, precise striking technique, likening his ability to take down opponents like a matador facing a bull. Initially, Topuria wasn't fully comfortable with the violent connotation of killing a bull, but he embraced it as a fitting emblem for his finishing instincts in the octagon. In March 2025, ahead of moving up to lightweight, he announced a rebranding to La Leyenda, meaning the legend. However, shortly after, he reverted back to El Matador, with many fans reacting that the original nickname was more fitting and less pretentious. Boars. Hamza Chimaev's nickname Boars is a powerful nod to his Chechen heritage. Boars is the word for wolf in Chechen. In Chechen culture, the wolf symbolizes bravery, loyalty, and strength. The term Boars also historically referred to the homemade submachine guns used in Chechnya during the 1990s conflict. While Chimaev identifies more with the animal symbolism, the double meaning emphasizes his toughness and readiness for combat. Poatan. Alex Pereira's nickname Poatan has a powerful meaning rooted in his heritage and incredible punching power. The name Poatan is derived from the Tupi language and means stone hands, reflecting his extraordinary knockout power. It was given by his first kickboxing coach, a Brazilian of indigenous descent, who noticed both Pereira's ancestral roots and his brutal, hard-hitting fists. Stone hands perfectly encapsulates his devastating left hook and striking ability, powerful tool that defined his kickboxing accolades and his meteoric rise in the UFC. Beyond mere words, Pereira actually tattooed small stone pebbles on his hand. The Machine. Merab Dvalishvili's nickname, The Machine, perfectly captures his relentless pace, immense cardio, and non-stop pressure. A fitting title given by a coach turned teammate who saw Dvalishvili bulldoze through everyone in the gym. UFC lightweight fighter Matt Frevola, who trained alongside him, coined the name. "You're a machine, bro. You don't stop," he said, noting how Merab runs through people in training. Sugar. Sean O'Malley's nickname Sugar, or Sugar, comes from one of his early coaches in Montana, and it reflects more than just a catchy moniker. It's about his fight style and appeal. Coach Johnny Aho, who led O'Malley early in his MMA career in Montana, gave him the name Sugar. It wasn't randomly picked. It was a nod to O'Malley's style. Sweet to watch. Initially, Aho referred to him as the Spider, but Sean declined, not wanting to inadvertently mimic Anderson Silva, so Sugar stuck instead. The Diamond. Dustin Poirier's nickname The Diamond carries a lot of meaning and perfectly reflects his resilience. Poirier received the nickname early in his amateur MMA career, and it was meant to reflect how he emerged stronger from pressure. He earned the nickname because of his ability to absorb incredible strikes and then came out on top. Blessed. Max Holloway's nickname Blessed was given to him naturally early in his UFC career and reflects both his fast rise and grounded mindset. Holloway explained that he was achieving success quickly, securing wins and performance bonuses. His coach remarked, "You're blessed, man." The moniker stuck from that moment onwards. The Baddie, a training partner of Paddy Pimblett, asked if he had a nickname, and Paddy said no. Then his coach casually chimed in, "Paddy the Baddie it is." The name stuck instantly, and Paddy embraced it on the spot. The Last Stylebender. Israel Adesany's nickname, The Last Stylebender, is a creative anime-inspired vision of his martial identity, chosen and molded entirely by him. The nickname is a nod to the beloved anime series Avatar: The Last Airbender. Adesanya, a passionate anime fan, was drawn to the series' central message, mastering the elements and, metaphorically, mastering styles of fighting. Adesanya has said he coined the name himself after feeling a deep connection with the show's ethos, a blend of mastery, art, and personal evolution. The Great. Volkanovski's father is Macedonian and his mother is Greek, mirroring the lineage of the ancient conqueror Alexander the Great, who united Greece and Macedonia. He embraced the nickname to celebrate and acknowledge his shared cultural background. But early in his journey, training and competing in Australia, he was nicknamed the Hulk due to his brute strength. And as his style transformed more into technical, strategic game, he adopted the Great to better reflect his skills, heritage, and ambition. Rush. In his early fights, especially before becoming a UFC champion, GSP was known for his aggressive, fast finishes, often rushing his opponents with takedowns, striking, and pressure. He earned the nickname Rush, as fans and commentators noticed how quickly he overwhelmed his opponents. He finished 5 of his first 7 fights by either KO or TKO. As he progressed and became champion, GSP's style evolved. He became more tactical, risk-averse, and dominant through control, using elite wrestling and fight IQ. Ironically, by the time he was the most dominant welterweight ever, he wasn't really rushing anymore. The Spider. Anderson Silva's nickname, The Spider, is one of the most iconic in MMA, and it perfectly matches his fighting style, long-limbed and elusive. Silva's nickname was inspired by the Marvel superhero Spider-Man. His movements in the cage, fluid, unpredictable, and web-like in range and control, made the comparison stick, El Cucuy. Tony Ferguson's nickname El Cucuy is one of the most intimidating in the UFC, and it fits his unorthodox, terrifying, and relentless fighting style perfectly. El Cucuy is a figure from Mexican folklore, a boogeyman-like creature that's used to scare children, similar to the monster under the bed. Tony, who has Mexican heritage, chose the name himself early in his career. He wanted a nickname that represented fear, chaos, and unpredictability, and El Cucuy was perfect for that. As he once said, "It's the boogeyman, bro. I'm the one under the bed." Still Knox. Dricus du Plessis, nicknamed Still Knox, is a clever play on the sleeping aid Still Knox. The nickname was coined by his brother around at the time he turned pro. It refers to Still Knox, implying that it puts people to sleep. The name stuck through his early MMA days, including a dominant span in the EFC where he continued finishing opponents early and decisively. No nickname. Islam Makhachev is one of the few elite fighters who famously does not have a nickname, and it's entirely by choice, reflecting his focus on authenticity and individuality. His coach at AKA, Javier Mendez, mentioned on the MMA Hour that he once suggested a nickname, but Islam Makhachev replied, "No, coach. My name's Islam." At a UFC 302 press conference, Islam said, "No, I don't want to have one because everybody has one. I'm that guy who doesn't have a nickname." The Reaper. Robert Whittaker is best known by the nickname The Reaper, though he's often referred to less officially as Bobby Knuckles. Here's the story behind both. The Reaper, chosen by Robert Whittaker himself. He crafted this nickname early in his UFC career as a symbol of his finishing prowess, inspired by the mythical figure of death, the Reaper. Bobby Knuckles is a fan-born nickname that was coined originally by the fans during the build-up to his fight with Kelvin Gastelum, not by Robert Whittaker himself. The name stuck as a playful alternative, spawning merch and social media buzz, but Whittaker hasn't fully embraced it. Dana White noted the Reaper as a more fearsome and appropriate name for Whittaker, and Whittaker agreed. Nomad. Shavkat Rakhmonov's nickname is Nomad, and it carries deep cultural and personal significance. Rakhmonov is proud of his Kazakh roots, and historically, the Kazakh people were pastoral nomads, moving across the steppes of Central Asia. Early in his career, during regional promotions like the Battle of the Nomads, he didn't have a nickname. Fellow fighters and fans started calling him Nomad, and the name naturally stuck. The Black Beast. Derek Lewis is famously known by the nickname The Black Beast. The nickname was first attached to him following his professional MMA debut in 2010, when he knocked out Nick Mitchell in the second round. Fans and commentators were struck by his power and presence, and the name The Black Beast quickly struck. UFC cover curse. The UFC cover curse is one of the most popular curses, and the premise is simple. At least one athlete featured on a UFC's game cover will suffer a significant setback, often loss, injury, or career derailment in their very next fight or shortly after. The curse started with the first UFC game. John Jones and Alexander Gustafsson were featured on the cover, and shortly after, John Jones was stripped of his light heavyweight title after testing positive for a banned substance, and Gustafsson suffered a brutal TKO loss to Anthony Johnson in his first fight after appearing on the cover. Then UFC 2 came along, featuring Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey on the cover. In Conor McGregor's next fight, he lost to Nate Diaz by submission, and Ronda Rousey got knocked out by Holly Holm. When UFC 3 came around, Conor McGregor was the sole athlete featured on the game's cover, and his next fight after the game was released would be against Khabib, where he lost by submission. The cover of UFC 4 was George Masvidal and Israel Adesanya, but Adesanya actually won his next fight against Paulo Costa, but not too long after he lost against Jan Blachowicz. The same couldn't be said for Masvidal though. Since that cover was released in August 2020, Masvidal hasn't won a fight since. UFC 5 featured Alexander Volkanovski and Valentina Shevchenko, with Israel Adesanya as the cover for the deluxe edition. Shortly after the game was announced, Israel Adesanya lost to Sean Strickland in one of the biggest upsets in middleweight history. Volkanovski lost to Islam Makhachev by head kick in the first round, and 3 months later, lost by knockout again to Ilia Topuria. Valentina was the only one on the cover to actually win her next fight, which was in a rematch against Alexa Grasso. Drake curse. The Drake curse is pretty simple. When Drake picks you or is rooting for you, you lose. The most famous time was when Conor McGregor brought out Drake to the weigh-ins for his fight against Khabib, and we all know how that went. But it didn't stop there. Drake has placed several bets on fighters to win, and they end up losing. Sean Strickland, George Masvidal, Israel Adesanya, Jose Aldo, Kamaru Usman, and Justin Gaethje were all affected by the Drake betting curse. Embedded haircut. The UFC embedded haircut curse is a superstition that arises from the UFC's behind-the-scenes YouTube series, UFC Embedded, which shows fighters' weight cuts, training camps, and daily routines in the days leading up to a pay-per-view event. In these episodes, cameras often follow fighters to barbershops for a last-minute haircut. Over time, fans noticed a pattern. Anytime a fighter got a haircut on camera and embedded, they tended to lose their next fight. This recurring outcome gave a rise to the haircut curse, implying that appearing on embedded, getting a haircut meant impending defeat. The curse gained traction around 2015 to 2016. Luke Rockhold and Rose Namajunas both visited the barbershop on embedded before their title bouts. bouts, and each went on to lose. Other fighters that have been victim of this curse were Max Holloway, Anthony Pettis, and Johnny Walker. Conan O'Brien curse. The Conan O'Brien curse is a superstition within the MMA community suggesting that any UFC fighter who appears on the Conan O'Brien late night talk show loses their next bout. The belief gained traction around 2016 when a string of high profile fighters, all coming off big wins, went on Conan's couch to promote a title fight and then ended up losing that fight. Conor McGregor went on to promote his fight with Nate Diaz. He lost by submission. Miesha Tate went on to promote her fight with Amanda Nunes. She lost by submission. Nate Diaz went on to promote the rematch with McGregor, and he lost by decision. Ronda Rousey went on to promote her fight against Nunes as well. She lost by TKO in the very first round. Finally, Michael Bisping went on to promote his fight against George St. Pierre. He would lose his belt by rear naked choke. The curse mythology remained intact until July 2018, when champion Daniel Cormier appeared on Conan in the week leading up to his heavyweight title fight against Stipe Miocic. But Cormier went on to defeat Miocic, thereby breaking the so-called curse. After the win, Cormier returned on Conan and jokingly revealed that he felt relieved to have beaten Miocic despite having gone on the show, effectively ending the streak of losses.
How soon after you won this match did you think about the Conan curse?
Immediately.
Did you really?
Immediately. When I got to the back, the UFC PR came over and they said, "Great job, things are gonna get crazy." I said, "Nothing's crazier than the fact that I just won this fight, even though I went to Conan."
35 and up curse. The 35 and up curse refers to a phenomenon where male UFC fighters aged 35 and older, competing in weight classes from flyweight up to welterweight, have an overwhelmingly poor record in title fights. In the UFC's men's divisions below welterweight, fighters aged 35 and up went 2-31 in championship bouts for several years, effectively creating a statistical curse that suggested that they were unlikely to win. The reason is because fighters aged 35 and older often begin to experience declines in factors crucial at lower weight classes: speed, reaction time, recovery rate, and cardio. Because flyweight through lightweight bouts emphasize pace and volume striking, even a slight deterioration in reflexes can be decisive. While heavyweights and light heavyweights sometimes enjoy success beyond 35, given size and strength tend to decline more slowly, lighter divisions amplify age-related disadvantages, reinforcing the curse stigma. But on April 12, 2025, Alexander Volkanovski, who was 36 years old, won the vacant featherweight title by unanimous decision over Diego Lopez. This victory marked the first time a fighter aged 35 or older in any men's division from 125 to 155 secured a UFC championship, officially ending the UFC's 35 and up curse in those weight classes. Tony Khabib curse. The so-called Tony vs. Khabib curse refers to the fact that UFC lightweight contenders Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov had their matchup booked a total of 5 times between 2015 and 2020, and 0 times did the fight actually occur. Each time the bout was scheduled, something out of the fighter's control, like injury, illness, or global circumstances, forced a cancellation. Fans and media began referring to it as a curse because of how persistently the matchup fell through despite its hype. The first booking was canceled because Khabib pulled out with a rib injury. In the second booking, Tony pulled out of the fight 11 days before because of blood and fluid in his lungs. In the third booking, Khabib pulled out due to a brutal weight cut. In the week of the fourth booking, Tony Ferguson tore his LCL tripping over a wire at a television studio during the promotion for the fight, causing him to withdraw. And in the final attempt, they booked the fight for the 5th time on April 18th, 2020. And what happened? COVID. Silva curse. The Anderson Silva curse is a way MMA fans describe a pattern in which opponents of Anderson Silva, whether they beat him, lost to him, or even shared a cage, seem to suffer bizarre setbacks. Weidman upset Silva twice, taking his belt, breaking his leg, and starting a 1-7 streak for Silva. Rockhold beats Weidman, taking his belt and starting a 2-6 streak for Weidman. Bisping KOs Rockhold, starting a 1-3 skid for Rockhold. GSP chokes out Bisping to win the belt and immediately goes back into retirement, ending the curse. Salt Lake City curse. The Salt Lake City head kick curse refers to a striking phenomenon in which consecutive UFC main events held at Salt Lake City end with head kick knockout finishes, so much that fans jokingly treat it like a jinx on opponents who step into the octagon. In the first instance, Leon Edwards landed a perfectly timed head kick with under a minute remaining to dethrone Kamaru Usman and claim the welterweight championship. That knockout, coming off a rematch where Usman had dominated earlier rounds, immediately sparked talk of Salt Lake City as head kick territory. Less than a year later, at Salt Lake City, Justin Gaethje again invoked the Salt Lake City's head kick lore. In the co-main event for the BMF title, Justin Gaethje head kicked Dustin Poirier, and the only difference was that Gaethje threw the head kick on the opposite side as Leon. With that back-to-back Salt Lake City head kick KO, the curse narrative gained even more traction online. When the UFC returned to Salt Lake City a year later, fans anticipated a third straight head kick finish. Khalil Roundtree nearly delivered, setting up a head kick attempt that would have made it 3 in a row. However, Alex Pereira weathered the storm, later stopping Roundtree by strikes and breaking the streak. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe.